only to realize that in the Tafferty family, true feelings are a dangerous luxury. Will he find solace with Candace, or will the family's secrets pull them all under? Greg loved to run. He ran to school every morning, no matter what the weather was like. Even the chilly November air couldn't stop him from enjoying his exercise. That was what good running clothes were made for. His running pants fit tightly against his legs and had soft fleece lining. They were black with red and orange flames that curved around his calves. Wearing them made him feel speedy. Every day he would run, take a shower at school, and get dressed there before his classes. This routine gave him strength and stamina, which were important for being the star wide receiver on his high school football team. With the quarterback's strong and accurate throws, they had led the team to the championships. Today's game would determine the state champion. This morning, he felt especially energized as he ran the last blocks to school. His good mood might have come from the night before when he had been invited upstairs to his girlfriend's room for the first time. He had been curious about what it would be like. She had called him over, saying she wanted to talk about something important, but as soon as he arrived, she had taken him upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed, smiling at him in a way that made his heart race. He had been excited to spend this private time together. He took the opportunity to look around her room, which was just as he had imagined. There were posters of boy bands and popular male actors on the walls. He felt a little unsure about how he fit into her world. Watching her smile and seeing her eyelashes flutter made him feel special. He hoped there was more to their connection than just how he looked. When she finally sat up and smiled at him, he was ready for the usual small talk. Instead, she surprised him by asking him to stand so she could help him. As he remembered that moment, he crossed a busy street, waving at a few friends in their cars, waiting for the light to change. Thinking about the previous night made him chuckle. He felt a mix of excitement and nerves. While he had hoped for something thrilling, it turned out to be a little less than he expected. Still, it was a step forward. Crystal had been hesitant to show any affection beyond gentle kisses. He wondered if she was uncomfortable with being more intimate. He had even researched what might be going on with her feelings. This morning he felt hopeful, but then he remembered his encounter with Crystal's older half-sister, Candace, the night before. After spending time together, he had to clean up in the hallway restroom instead of the one in Crystal's room. As he left the washroom, he bumped into Candace. Her long blonde hair was dyed a soft pink, which she used to cover one side of her face. He thought the side she showed was beautiful, but he knew she felt shy about the scars on the other side. She looked at him with curiosity, so he smiled and said hello. He worried that she might have overheard their earlier activities, yet to his surprise, she cautiously pushed her hair back to reveal her scars. He was shocked that she chose to show him. The scars were jagged, starting just above her brow and running down to her jawline. Smaller scars followed along. When he looked into her eyes, he smiled at her, but she quickly made a sound and hurried to her room next to Crystal's. Feeling a sense of sympathy for her, he thought about how she was so intelligent despite the accident that had left her with these scars. Greg ran across the school grounds and waved to Mr. Marcy, the football coach. The coach smiled and waved back, clearly excited about the upcoming game. As he walked through the halls toward the gym, he greeted a few friends. He spotted Crystal chatting with Heather, who was dating his friend Tim, and Valerie, who was dating Pete, one of the team's defense players. Crystal was a stunning young woman with red hair, and she caught his eye each time she smiled. However, she wasn't smiling right then. He adjusted his path and approached the group, hoping to bring back her smile. "Hey, beautiful. Hi, Heather, Valerie," he said with a grin, holding Crystal's gaze. She looked him over, taking in his fit physique and the sweat on his face from running. As he leaned in for a quick kiss, she reacted with a gentle breath, feeling the chill of the November air. He received a quick peck instead of the gentle kiss he hoped for, and he looked at her as he pulled back. "You're sweaty," she stated, shifting a bit uncomfortably. He smiled uncertainly, confused about her reluctance. She had previously mentioned enjoying his scent. "I just ran to school," he explained. "Then you should get cleaned up before first bell," she suggested, clearly wanting to end the conversation. He nodded and moved away, replaying their brief exchange as he walked to the gym. What just happened? He wondered as he entered the shower room. He placed his backpack in a locker, took off his running clothes, and stuffed them inside. He grabbed his shampoo, soap, and towel before quickly washing off in the shower. After scrubbing his long, straight black hair, which now hung down to his shoulders, he rinsed off. Yet he still found himself troubled by Crystal's reaction. As he dried off and got dressed, an old worry came back to him. When Crystal first started dating him, he was very aware of the different backgrounds their families had. Greg's family, the Hughes, owned a small software company that served clients in Europe and Asia. His dad traveled a lot for work, leaving Greg and his mom home for weeks. Even though this wasn't ideal, his parents loved each other deeply, giving Greg a sense of stability. They were comfortable enough to be considered middle class. In contrast, Crystal's family was wealthy. She was the daughter of Byron Tafferty, the richest businessman in the county, if not the entire state. He owned the mines and all mining rights in their area. The Tafferty family founded the town of Hampstead Hills nearly a century ago and played a key role in its growth. Greg often worried that one day Crystal might choose someone from her own social class. Even though she said she was happy with him, the doubt still lingered in his mind. While the Tafferty family once had many members, it had now dwindled to just 5. At the forefront was Byron, the father figure in his early 60s, who remained influential and wise in business. There were whispers about his harshness, and Crystal's stories made Greg believe these rumors were true. Byron was married to his second wife, Missy. She was tall and had become his wife just a year after the passing of his first wife, Ellie. Now, in her mid-30s, Missy was the reason Crystal had her striking red hair and beauty. The 18-year-old daughter didn't quite share her mother's curves, but was still a graceful version of her. Cal Tafferty, Byron's oldest child, was now 25. Ellie gave birth to Candace, but sadly passed away during childbirth. Now Candace is 21 years old. The Tafferty home is a large mansion with 8 bedrooms, located in the Oak Hills community. In comparison, the Hughes family lives in a much smaller 2-bedroom house on Aspen Grove Crescent on the other side of town. From Crystal's tales and his own few meetings with him, Greg saw that Cal was not a nice person. He was selfish, arrogant, and acted like he deserved everything handed to him. He relied on his family's wealth and influence in the community. In high school, he was well known as the star quarterback, but now he was fading away, struggling with a drinking problem that everyone noticed. Greg believed Cal realized this but didn't know how to change. Candace's situation was even sadder, but Crystal preferred not to discuss her older half-sister much, especially regarding what happened recently. Since Candace lost her mother at birth, she and her brother were raised by the household staff. Missy looked after her daughter, following Byron's wishes. Crystal once mentioned that their father blamed Candace for Ellie's death, even though Ellie had a tough time giving birth to Cal as well. During her early years, Candace found comfort from the cook who cared for her until Byron discovered the cook's affection and fired her on the spot. This also upset Crystal. Cal barely scraped through school by focusing on football and his social life, while Candace showed incredible intelligence but struggled to make friends. Many found her unlikable due to her sharp words. She was very smart and didn't hesitate to show it, which often made others feel inferior. Additionally, her tall stature set her apart from her classmates. Candace grew taller than her peers from a young age. In school, other kids called her Taffy because of her length. By graduation, she stood at 6'2", with long, wavy blonde hair that reached down her back. She often hid her face behind her hair. Although she was fit and strong from using her home gym, her height made her self-conscious, leading her to follow a careful routine to keep her back healthy. Despite her beauty, she felt lonely throughout high school. After graduation, Cal's life began to go downhill as he fell into drinking too much. A few years later, Candace graduated at the top of her class but had no friends. This is where Crystal would stop talking and change the subject, but Greg learned the story from people who had witnessed it. The year Candace graduated, there was a big party for her classmates, and to everyone's surprise, she arrived in a taxi. Though she tried to join in, no one spoke to her, and she ended up drinking until she fell asleep on a swing. When she woke up, the party was coming to an end, and someone had taken money from her wallet. She couldn't pay for a taxi home, so she called her family for a ride. Cal came, a bit tipsy, and had a few drinks before being asked to leave. It was said that he got Candace into his car and drove away quickly, driving wildly. The next morning, news spread through town that Cal had crashed his car into a tree, and Candace was hurt badly, ending up in the hospital and unconscious. The accident left her with serious scars on her face. When Candace woke up from her coma, she showed signs of serious brain injury. She was no longer the smart young adult she had been, but had the mind of a young child. Thinking about this made Greg feel uneasy. The bell rang for the first period, bringing Greg out of his thoughts. He realized he had been sitting on the bench in the locker room. He quickly finished getting ready and hurried off to class. He would deal with whatever was troubling Crystal later. "No, Candy, you can't go into the maternity ward." Large blue eyes looked at the nurse, who was Nurse Hershey. She didn't like Candace and seemed frightened by her challenges. Candy turned to try entering the ward again and heard a sigh behind her. A hand grabbed her arm and pulled. Candy held on to the doorframe. Another sigh came from the nurse, and she pulled harder, making it hurt. Fear made the nurse strong, but Candace held on tightly. Feeling frustrated, she said, "Okay, if you keep this up, I will get Margaret. She's the head nurse, and she will make sure you can't volunteer here anymore. Is that what you want?" Candy pouted, but did not let go of the door. After a huff, Nurse Hershey let go of Candace's arm and walked away in anger. As soon as the nurse was gone, Candace quickly walked the other way, leaving the maternity ward behind. She had only 10 minutes if she planned this right. She slipped into the stairwell and hurried down 2 floors. She peeked out the door to check if anyone was around. She had made sure earlier in the day that the hospital's security cameras were not working. She went to the records room door and used a key she had made from the custodian's key ring. It was a master key, and it would help her get inside. She quietly entered and hurried down the aisles, scanning the boxes on the shelves for the date of the accident. She finally found it in a back corner. Listening carefully and hearing nothing, she pulled the file box down and flipped through the pages until she located the records for that night. She took pictures of the pages, trying not to dwell on them, as she didn't have time. After putting them back, she searched for Cal's file. Again, she snapped pictures, avoiding looking at the pages, but one number caught her eye. They had done a blood test showing a blood alcohol level of 0, 134. She stopped for a moment. She knew her brother had been drinking, but now she had proof. The local sheriff's department had overlooked evidence during their tests at the scene and ignored the hospital's paperwork. She quickly returned the papers to the box and placed it back on the shelf. Glancing at her Hello Kitty watch, she saw she had only 3 minutes left. She retraced her steps to the maternity ward entrance and sat on the floor next to the door, resting her head on her knees. She took deep breaths and thought about the saddest memories she had, like the day the family cook was let go. "There she is! I told you!" Hershey's voice echoed. "Hush! Let me talk to her." That was Margaret. A gentle hand brushed Candace's dyed pink hair. She looked up into the eyes of Margaret Stewart, the head nurse. Margaret saw the tears in her blue eyes. "Are you okay, dear?" she asked, her Scottish accent evident as she expressed her concern. "My arm hurts," Candace replied softly. Margaret's eyebrows lifted as she rolled back Candy's sleeve, revealing bruises from Nurse Hershey's tight grip. Margaret lifted Candy's chin and looked into her eyes. "Who did this?" Candy's blue eyes shifted towards Hershey. "She doesn't like me," she whispered, sounding like a little girl. Margaret sighed. "Did you try to enter the maternity ward?" "Just at the door, to listen to the babies," Candy said quietly. "All right, I'll have a word with Nurse Hershey. For now, please stay away from the maternity ward." Candy opened her mouth as if to protest, but then nodded. Margaret helped her stand, and Candy glanced at Hershey, who looked frustrated. "She has promised not to go into the maternity ward. Let's go talk to the nurses inside. I also need to discuss the bruises on Miss Tafferty's arm," Margaret said calmly, despite Hershey's outburst. The head nurse stressed Candace's last name as a reminder. Although the young woman might be seen as needing help, she was still a Tafferty. Candy walked away, no longer worried about the nurses. In her mind, she was figuring out her next steps. She felt bad for tricking Mrs. Stewart, as she had come to see that the strict woman had a kind heart. When she completed her plan, she would apologize sincerely, even if she didn't expect Mrs. Stewart to forgive her. She knew it was the right thing to do. It took her 2 years to reach this point because she knew her plan needed time. She often visited the hospital, and her bright pink hair made people relax and pay her little attention. She moved from room to room with her small cart, offering books and games to the patients. Sometimes she just sat and listened to older patients talk, helping them calm down. The doctors and nurses appreciated what she did. She noticed that people accepted her now. Her quick mind no longer scared them, and she chose her words carefully, so they liked having her around. It felt new and nice. But still, she knew she had to keep her mission in focus. Getting the master key had been tricky, but she walked around the hospital freely, and the cleaning staff became used to seeing her in the basement. They usually pointed her back to the elevators unless they were busy. They had a key-cutting machine and let her watch them use it. She learned where the master keys were kept and borrowed a set of keys during dinner hour when the main person took a break. Fortunately, the noise in the room helped hide the sound of her cutting the key. She returned the keys before he woke up. With the photos safely stored on her phone and her work shift ending, Candace made her way home. A bus picked her up by the hospital and dropped her off at the entrance of her neighborhood. While waiting, she looked back at the hospital and realized she would soon not have to spend so much time there. This thought made her feel mixed emotions. She had started to enjoy how people opened up to her. The loneliness she felt her whole life faded while she was there. She noticed that when she listened more and spoke less, people felt more comfortable around her. She remembered how she used to talk to people with harsh words and critical tones. This new approach was showing her things about herself she hadn't expected. Then her thoughts drifted back to the painful night after her accident. She remembered waking up in pain and overhearing her father tell the surgeon that he wouldn't pay for more treatments for her injuries. The scars on her face would be a reminder of her own mistakes. She felt shocked by the harshness in his voice. That night, she realized he wanted to let her go. He knew she was smart and must have worried she would find out about the financial plans he had for the company funds, especially regarding the workers' pension. Knowing what she knew helped her understand the situation better. At first, she just wanted to get back at him. She planned to turn his own tricks against him. The best way to do that was to stay in his house for now. So she came up with a plan. In the beginning, it was easy to stay quiet after waking up. Pretending to be like a young child was harder, but her injuries made it easier to believe. It matched what the doctors thought. When an expert came to check on her, Candace realized the woman had already made up her mind based on what she heard from the other doctors. It was easy for Candace to trick the expert since she wasn't looking for anything else. The bus arriving pulled her thoughts back to the present. The driver smiled when he saw her. She returned his smile. "Good evening, Candy," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Dillon," she replied. "Did you have a nice day?" he asked. "The best yet," she answered, a response that always made him laugh. As she walked to her seat, she felt she would miss their chats. Keeping a smile on her face was hard, and that troubled her too. Even though she had been working on her plan for 2 years, she had not thought about how much these friendships would matter to her. She didn't want to go back to feeling alone. She would think about that when she got home. Greg ran onto the field and joined his teammates. Tim greeted him with a big grin. "How about we start this game with a big play?" Tim suggested, causing a few laughs. "You want to break their spirits right away?" Greg asked, pretending to be surprised. "Now's the perfect time to show them who they're up against. Do you still have energy left, or did you use it all running after Crystal?" Tim joked. "Look at you trying to be funny. Just throw the ball, will you?" Greg replied with a grin. They clapped their hands and took their positions. Greg looked at the players he would have to dodge. The cornerback and outside linebacker were watching him closely. He knew he could outrun the linebacker, but the cornerback was quick. He had to be careful. Tim started calling the plays, and Greg focused on where he needed to be. When the ball was snapped, he took off. As he expected, the cornerback followed him closely, while the linebacker surprised him by running the other way. Greg decided not to worry about that player and opened his stride, pulling ahead of the cornerback. It was time. He turned his head to the side to follow the pass, his hands ready to catch the ball, which was coming in right about Tim watched in shock as the linebacker collided with Greg in a sudden tackle, the top of his helmet hitting Greg's head and making it jerk to the side. A moment later, the cornerback ran into Greg's legs. Tim saw Greg's body turn in the air as the football flew past him. His friend landed hard under the heavy linebacker. End of play. Greg slowly came back to his senses. His head hurt, everything hurt. He tried to remember what happened, but that made it worse. He might have made a small sound. "Mr. Hughes? Are you awake?" Greg opened his eyes and turned toward the voice. Someone in a doctor's coat stood by him. "Yes," he managed to say. "Good. I'm Dr. Green. You've taken quite a hit to the head, and you have a concussion. That's why you're feeling so much pain. You also have a broken bone in your left leg, so it's a good thing football season is over." Greg's heart raced as he suddenly remembered the championship game. "The game," he said, and leaned back against his pillow, feeling pain spike. "That was yesterday. You've been resting here since you arrived at the hospital. What's the last thing you remember?" "But take it easy," Dr. Green said. The pain increased as he tried to think back to the game. 2 ran onto the field, and Tim said we were doing a long pass. His memory went blank after that. "What happened?" The doctor smiled. "From what I heard, the other team wanted to take you out early because they saw you as a threat. You were hit hard by 2 of their players." Greg had trouble keeping up with the conversation. "What was the final score?" Dr. Green's smile got bigger. "Your team won." Greg managed a small smile before he drifted off again. The doctor checked Greg's eyes and prepared to leave the room to share good news with a worried parent. He walked down the hall to the waiting room where a group of anxious teens and a woman, likely Mrs. Hughes, waited for updates. He noticed the pink hair of Candy standing off to the side, looking a bit lost. Then he saw her sister. "Mrs. Hughes?" he asked, and the nervous woman nodded. He gave her a reassuring smile. "Greg's going to be fine. He has a concussion, so we'll keep him here for a few days just to be safe. His left leg has a clean break, so it will heal in time. He'll need a cast for a while." "So, no running until then?" a tall blonde man asked with a slight smile to lighten the mood for the mother. The doctor returned the smile. "No running for now." Mrs. Hughes sighed in relief. Hughes looked at the blonde man with gratitude in her smile, although her eyes seemed a bit watery. "Can I see him?" "He's sleeping right now. He should be able to see a few visitors tomorrow. His mind went through a lot, so we'll keep visits short at first and not stress him too much. Is that okay?" The group nodded. The thankful mother shook his hand, feeling relieved. He finished his task and moved on. From the corner of the waiting room, Candace quietly watched Crystal's reactions. The night before, she had overheard her telling Missy that Greg was hurt during the game. They were told to wait until morning to visit him at the hospital. Candace was surprised to see the mix of relief and guilt on her half-sister's face. She grew curious, as she thought Crystal and Greg were a happy couple. From the sounds she heard when Greg visited Crystal, they seemed very happy together. Listening in, she felt a rush of emotions and realized she needed to remove the listening device she had hidden in Crystal's room. After eavesdropping, Candace unexpectedly found herself waiting outside the restroom when Greg accidentally bumped into her. She hadn't meant to show him her scars. When he didn't react negatively and smiled at her, she quickly left, feeling flustered. She had heard Crystal tell their mother she would come to the hospital today with her friends and that Greg's mom would likely be there too. Candace made sure to be in the waiting room when they arrived. Greg's friend Tim greeted her with a smile, but his girlfriend Heather seemed tense, much like Crystal often did. She and Crystal had never been close because their father forbade it. Candace kept her distance to protect Crystal from their father's anger. The doctor's reassurance and departure showed Candace that Greg's mom still looked worried. Tim hugged her and whispered something, making her smile gratefully when he let go. "Unlike Greg, who gets to relax today, some of us have part-time jobs that require us to work on Saturdays. Plus, we need to share the good news since many people will want to hear it," Tim said, and the group nodded in agreement. Candace noticed the woman looked stronger because of Tim's words. She admired how his confidence put people at ease. He was respectful and wasn't loud and annoying like Cal. Candace waited for Crystal to hug Mrs. Hughes, but instead, she was one of the first to leave the waiting room. This caught the older woman's attention. Without knowing why, Candace stepped forward, moved in front of her, and hugged her. Mrs. Hughes was surprised at first, but then softened at the unexpected gesture. Hughes soon embraced Candace, and they remained like that for a moment. Candace gently let go and looked into Hughes's eyes to check if she was all right. "Thank you," Hughes said to Candace. "I don't think I've seen you before, and Greg usually brings everyone home." She smiled lovingly, thinking of her son. "I'm Kate." "Candy, aren't you supposed to be doing your rounds?" Nurse Hershey interrupted sharply. Candace glanced at the nurse and hurried away. She didn't want to be near the unpleasant woman. Their last encounter and the scolding from the head nurse had upset Nurse Hershey. Until Candace could complete her task, she needed to stay clear of her. As she walked past Greg's room, she paused for a moment outside the door. She promised herself she would check on him later. He was Crystal's boyfriend. Why was she drawn to him? Crystal leaned back against the pillows she'd stacked up at the head of her bed. The redhead glared at her blonde friend Heather and noticed Valerie hiding her face behind her dark hair, likely feeling the same way about Mrs. Hughes. "I'm just saying, as Greg's girlfriend, you should try to get along with his parents. She seems really nice," Heather explained, trying to soften her earlier comments. Crystal crossed her arms in frustration. "I've been trying to break up with him for a few weeks." "What? Why?" her friends exclaimed together. Crystal quieted them down. After a moment, Heather spoke first. "We thought everything was going well. You two look great together, and he's so attractive." Valerie jumped in. "Is it because he doesn't come from the best neighborhood?" Her friends looked puzzled, so she clarified. "He lives on the east side of the tracks while we live on the west?" Crystal frowned at her friend. "That doesn't matter. He isn't poor." "What reason do you have for wanting to break up?" Heather asked in disbelief. Crystal squirmed under her friend's stares. Finally, she admitted, "We aren't a good match." "You've been with him?" Valerie gasped, while Heather looked shocked. "No!" Crystal retorted, pouting. "It's just, we don't connect well." Heather and Valerie leaned in closer, curious. "What do you mean?" Valerie asked. "Greg is different in some ways." Crystal sighed, and their eyes widened. She shook her head. "He tends to be the same, no matter what." She felt frustrated and recalled moments they had shared. Heather exchanged a confused look with Valerie before turning back to Crystal. "What difference does it make?" "He's too big for me," Crystal said with frustration. "You're always saying that, and now I can't help but imagine something huge." Valerie laughed, making the others join in. When the laughter faded, Crystal shook her head. "He's maybe 7 inches long, but he's really thick. Too thick for me." "You've tried?" Heather asked carefully. Crystal shook her head again. "We haven't gone that far yet, but I just know it won't work," she said firmly. "You mentioned wanting to end things weeks ago. What happened?" Heather asked as Valerie went back to her daydreaming. Crystal looked Heather in the eyes. "Every time I thought about breaking up, I backed out. I ended up thinking just one more time." "You said you didn't have sex," Valerie interjected. "We didn't. But Greg is really good at other things and makes me feel amazing," Crystal said, a shiver of joy running through her at the memory. Valerie and Heather erupted in cheerful squeals, joining Crystal in their excitement. When they calmed down, Heather leaned a bit closer. "He's really that good at it." Crystal nodded with a dreamy face, which soon turned serious. "If only he wouldn't expect so much in return." "Wait, you haven't done anything for him?" Valerie exclaimed in shock. "We kiss! He's a fantastic kisser. I let him touch me. I might have gotten a little carried away the night before the game," she said defensively. "You've never done anything with your mouth?" Heather asked quietly. Crystal shook her head, her eyes wide in surprise. Heather made a circle with her thumb and finger, trying to guess Greg's size. The redhead rolled her eyes and adjusted Heather's fingers to show Greg's actual size. Heather looked at her curiously. "That's a decent size, maybe a bit larger than Tim, but I wouldn't say it is too big to handle. We can adjust, you know." Valerie grabbed Heather's hand, still staring with disbelief. "Wow, Pete is much smaller. Would you want to switch boyfriends?" "I'm really small, okay?" Crystal said defensively. "I've tested it. I even bought something to help." "What? Where did you get that? They don't sell those in shops around here," Heather exclaimed, blushing as she realized she sounded like someone who had looked. "I ordered it online from a good and private website. They sent it in a plain package," Crystal explained. Heather was shocked. "Weren't you worried someone might see it, like your mom or even your dad?" Crystal shook her head. "Dad is too busy to care about mail that isn't his." She paused for a moment before saying, "Mom's ordered stuff like that too, since Dad is often busy." This made them giggle again. Finally, something clicked in Crystal's mind. "Wait, you two seem to know quite a lot about your boyfriend's sizes. You've been with him." They smiled, and the redhead felt a hint of jealousy. "Maybe if you stopped using fancy words for it, you'd be less concerned about intimacy," Heather said. Seeing the anger rise, she quickly added, "I'm actually really jealous of the attention Greg gives you, though. Tim doesn't spend much time on that part of our relationship." Valerie joined in. "Pete doesn't like to do much when it comes to me. I wish I could feel what Greg does for you, even just once." They had calmed her frustration, but sadness took its place. "I should end things with him, but I feel like I can't let go of the good feelings he brings." Heather chuckled but saw her friend was serious. "How often does this happen?" 2 or 3 times a week, Crystal sighed. "Wow!" Valerie exclaimed, surprised by the idea. Heather tried to think it through. "How do you find time for this with all your activities?" Crystal grinned playfully. "Most of the time it's at his place after school since his mom works. Greg enjoys it. We even found a moment in a supply closet at school once. It was a quick thing, but it was exciting. And you didn't do anything nice for him in return? Is he a saint or just foolish?" Heather wondered out loud. Crystal threw a pillow at her. Heather frowned. "Come on. You have to see that your relationship feels one-sided." Crystal pouted again. "I know, okay? It's a lot," she complained. "Then let him go gently. He'll be hurt and maybe upset, but the longer you stay, the harder it will be for both of you," Heather said softly. Crystal glared, but she understood and nodded. Still, the timing was terrible. Greg was lying back on his pillow, watching the clouds outside his window. He knew much of the comfort he felt came from the medication they had him on. The concussion was finally getting better, but he still had to deal with his broken leg. He heard a noise and looked to see his mom entering his room. The other bed was empty, giving them some privacy. Her smile made him smile back. "Hi, Mom." Her grin grew wider and her eyes sparkled. He loved seeing her happy. "Good morning, sweetie. How are you feeling today?" she asked. "I feel great, if you know what I mean," he replied with a grin. Her smile turned into a smirk. "Should I ask the doctors to lower your meds?" "Please don't. I think it's too soon for that. I can feel the pain lurking under the medicine. Right now, I'm really thankful for their help," he said, feeling a throb in his head, reminding him of his words. Her face showed worry again when she noticed him flinch a little. "Is there anything I can do for you?" she asked, taking his hand gently. He smiled to reassure her. "Not at the moment. I think the doctors have things under control. Have you heard from Dad?" She nodded, her smile returning. "He called last night and wishes you a quick recovery." "How did his meeting go?" Greg asked, closing his eyes to ease the ache in his head. He felt a soft kiss on his forehead and opened his eyes to see his mom pulling away. "It went well, but they are still working on some details. I can see you're in pain from your concussion, so I need to go to work now. I'll check in on you when I get home, okay?" He nodded and smiled as he started to drift off again. He realized he wasn't recovering from the concussion as fast as he had hoped. Greg turned back to the window to watch the clouds, but he fell asleep before he could see them move. Candace made sure to arrive outside Greg's room when the nurses were busy elsewhere. She quietly placed her cart against the wall out of sight, hiding behind a gurney. When the way was clear, she stepped into the room and listened. The only sound was Greg's calm breathing as he rested against the pillows. She moved closer and looked down at his sleeping face. He looked so peaceful and pure. But he wasn't pure. He had moments with Crystal that Candace longed for herself. It didn't seem fair. She'd never had a boyfriend. She'd never been kissed. She yearned for a man's touch and the warmth of a true embrace. Candace felt a deep longing, and Crystal seemed to throw those moments away. The night before, while she was waiting to take out her listening device from Crystal's room, she overheard her sister and her friends giggling with the door closed. Unable to help herself, she listened in and heard her sister's secret thoughts. Candace bit her lip, imagining Greg sharing a sweet moment with her, his hands gently moving through her hair. She suddenly remembered the time he had bumped into her in the hall. She sighed softly, causing Greg to stir. His eyes slowly opened. She felt frozen. "Candace?" he asked in a sleepy voice. She didn't know what to say. Being there felt risky. Greg was waking up, looking at her with curiosity. He didn't seem frightened to find her there. "Is Crystal here?" he asked, and she could hear the hope in his voice. That made her heart ache a little for him. Knowing what she had heard from Crystal and her friends the night before, she worried about what was ahead for Greg if Crystal didn't let her desires take over again. Candace was not so sure it wouldn't happen. She noticed how spoiled her little sister had become. Even though she didn't know Greg very well, from the few times he talked to her, she could tell he did not deserve to be treated badly. He seemed like a genuinely nice guy. "Is everything okay? You look sad," he said. His words pulled her back to the moment, and she forced a smile. His gaze shifted to the door, almost as if waiting for Crystal to come in. It was painful to watch, so she quickly turned away and stepped out of the room. She grabbed her cart and moved on. One thought kept repeating in her mind. It wasn't fair. On Monday afternoon after school, Tim and Heather visited Greg and found him awake. "Hey, buddy. Sorry we didn't come by yesterday, but the doctor said you needed to rest. How are you feeling?" Tim asked, shaking Greg's hand. "My head doesn't hurt as much anymore," Greg replied. "Wow, you're doing better," Tim joked. "Very funny," Greg replied with a grin. Heather smiled at their playful banter and leaned in to give Greg a quick kiss on the cheek. Her mind flashed back to what Crystal had told her. Greg raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Thanks, but what was that for?" He had never received a kiss like that from her before. She felt embarrassed. "You really scared us all?" she said, flustered by her own action. Tim chuckled. "Oh, I see how it is, Greg. You got hurt on purpose to steal all our girlfriends." Greg laughed along with Tim. While he needed the quiet time to recover, he had felt a bit lonely. His mom had visited for a few hours on Sunday, and he had seen Candace peek into his room a few times to check on him. He missed his friends and was glad Tim came by. Tim pretended to bow to him. "On behalf of the team, I want to thank you for your sacrifice. It brought us together like never before. We won our game 473 and took home the trophy." Greg smirked at Tim's words. "You managed to use Ron as your receiver?" Tim laughed. "Ron was so inspired by you that he caught everything I threw. We've even given him a new nickname." Greg raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? What is it?" "Peanut Butter Fingers. Because he caught everything this time," Tim said, still chuckling. Greg's stomach growled. "Now I'm in the mood for a snack." Tim's expression changed. "Oh no, I left the donuts I got for you in the truck." "Hang on." Tim hurried out, leaving Heather behind. After a moment of silence, she sat on the edge of the bed, pulling the sheets tightly across Greg's lap. She couldn't help but notice a clear shape under the fabric. "Oh, I'm sorry," she stammered as Greg quickly adjusted the sheets to cover himself better. After looking at the evidence, her thoughts went back to the confession. "Crystal mentioned you were too big," she said softly, feeling flustered. Greg was shocked that Crystal would be speaking about their private moments. Then he realized what she meant by too big. His gaze met Heather's. As Heather struggled to gather her thoughts, she couldn't help but say more. "But she really praises your skill." Greg felt himself blush deeply, a mix of anger and embarrassment flooding him. Tim suddenly entered the room, slightly out of breath, holding a box of donuts. His cheerful expression faded when he saw that Greg was upset and noticed Heather's worried face. "What's happening?" Heather felt unsure and shook her head, looking defeated. "Crystal has been talking too much about us. This has to stop if she wants to stay my girlfriend," Greg said firmly. Heather lowered her head, trying to hide her feelings, but both Greg and Tim sensed that something was wrong. Tim put the donut box on the small table beside the bed and gently lifted Heather's chin to meet her gaze. "I think it's time to be honest." Heather glanced at Greg and then back at Tim. "He'll find out later when Crystal comes to visit. It's not really my place to say. I've messed things up already. Crystal will explain." "Wow, she's going to break up with me." Greg felt confused, thinking everything was going well. He knew she had some issues. "Is it because she thinks I'm too big?" he asked softly. Once again, her face showed him he had guessed right. He stared at Heather. "Why did she lead me on for so long? She got what she wanted from me and left me hanging. I was willing to wait. Ugh!" Heather flinched at Greg's outburst and looked at Tim for help, but it was clear he was siding with Greg. Nurse Stewart entered the room looking concerned. "What's going on here? Who was shouting? No raising voices in the hospital." Heather stood next to Tim, looking sad. The nurse noticed Greg's upset expression. "Maybe it's time for your friends to leave, Mr. Hughes." "That's fine. I really don't want to see anyone but my mom," he replied, looking into her eyes. "Especially not Crystal," he added with a strained voice, and the nurse nodded. Greg looked at Tim, who gave him a supportive nod, and he returned it. He turned to the window, avoiding Heather's gaze. Nurse Stewart motioned for the couple to leave first, and they did, with her following closely behind. She informed the other nurses about the visitor restrictions for Greg, and soon the ward returned to its calm state. Crystal entered the ward just before visiting hours ended. She had spent a long time thinking of how to let Greg down gently. She had practiced her story so much that she almost believed it herself. In her mind, she imagined how he would react. In her favorite scenario, Greg would kindly ask to stay friends with some added benefits. As she walked down the hall, she realized she didn't even know which room he was in. She stopped by the nurse's station where two women were chatting. "Excuse me, could you please tell me which room Greg Hughes is in?" she asked politely. The older woman turned to her, and Crystal noticed a flicker of recognition. One benefit of being a Tafferty, she thought. The nurse approached the counter, her expression serious. "Mr. Hughes is not seeing visitors today." Crystal felt a wave of shock. "What, is he okay?" she asked, her heart racing. She feared he might be having problems from the concussion. The nurse softened a bit. "No, he is healing well. He had a visitor earlier who left him upset. Because he was too angry, he requested no more visitors except for his mother. But I'm his, and especially not you. I'm sorry, Miss Tafferty." Crystal stepped back, feeling stunned. Was he mad at her? He had visitors who made him upset? "Who were they?" she asked quietly. The nurse shook her head. "I didn't catch their names. They were friends from school, a tall blonde man and his blonde girlfriend. Heather. How could she betray her trust like that?" Crystal turned and rushed out of the hospital. Her eyes filled with tears, and she barely noticed a woman coming in. She quickly dodged around her and made a beeline for her car. Meanwhile, Nurse Stewart looked up as someone hurried to the nurse's station. It was Mrs. Hughes, looking worried. "Greg?" "He's fine, resting and healing well," said the head nurse right away. Relief washed over Mrs. Hughes, quickly followed by confusion. She pointed toward the entrance. "What's wrong with Crystal?" "Miss Tafferty just learned your son doesn't want to see her," the nurse replied. "Oh?" Mrs. Hughes glanced toward the front door and then back at the nurse. "Thank you," she said, moving quickly to her son's room. When she entered, she saw Greg staring out the window, tissues crumpled in his hand. "Greg? Honey?" she said softly. When he turned to her, his eyes were red from crying. "Hi, Mom," he said weakly. "What happened? I just saw Crystal leave in tears." She watched as anger and sadness crossed his face. Greg struggled to find the words. He swallowed before saying, "I feel so foolish. All this time she's been taking advantage of me." "What? Crystal? You both seem so happy together." His mother moved to his side and gently ran her fingers through his hair. Greg made a sound of frustration. He tried to clear his throat and managed to speak again. I thought it was love, but she never did." That was all Greg could say before the hurt in his heart overwhelmed him again. His body shook as silent tears fell. His mother stood beside him, gently touching his cheek. He leaned into her comforting presence. Candace stood in the hallway just outside Greg's room. Tears streamed down her face, too. She had heard Greg's words, and it was breaking her heart. She felt so angry with her sister, she wanted to shout. Greg had been so kind to Crystal, and she had taken advantage of him. Candace wanted so badly to go into the room and talk to him, but she knew she wouldn't be welcomed there now. "Candace, come away from there, that's private," Nurse Stewart gently scolded her, causing Candace to jump. "I'm sorry," Candace quickly replied and followed the nurse back to the station. Her emotions felt out of control. She usually managed them well, but thoughts of Greg sent her spinning. She suddenly reached out and touched the nurse's arm. The woman stopped and looked at her. "What is it, dear?" Candace's mind raced. She didn't know what to say, but felt a need to express something. "Greg is so sad," she said, feeling a bit foolish as her tears continued to fall. Margaret's expression softened and she hugged Candace. A broken heart hurts, but it's not the end. He has friends and his mother to help him through this. He'll be okay. With time. The nurse let go of Candace and offered her a kind smile before returning to her work. Candace stood in the hallway and realized she wouldn't be of help by staying. It was time for her to go home. Meanwhile, Crystal took another shot of whiskey and gasped as it burned down her throat. When she finished, she stared at the empty bottle. It had been half full when she started. She tried to set it back on the bar, but missed and dropped it. When it bounced and rolled away, relief washed over her, and she nearly lost her balance. The room swayed, and she clutched the back of her father's chair. She felt angry with Greg for making her feel embarrassed at the hospital. Why couldn't he have just listened to her? They could have parted on good terms without all the fuss. Maybe they could have continued to be friends. As she steadied herself, she realized that Heather's actions had ruined any chance of that. Anger at Heather surged within her. Crystal took deep breaths, trying to clear her spinning head. She felt regret knowing she had hurt Greg. She deeply regretted her actions, but believed things could have been easier for him if she had been able to talk to him before Heather told everyone. Crystal turned back to the bar, grabbed another bottle, and poured herself another drink. She slammed the bottle down and stared at it unsteadily. Then she drank the shot in one go. It traveled down her throat, but the sting was worse than expected. She coughed and dropped her glass as she stepped back from the bar. She bumped into a chair and fell over it. She tried to turn to break her fall, but the chair hit her hard. Pain shot through her and she felt sick, emptying her stomach onto the carpet next to the chair. Her head spun until she lost consciousness right there. Byron was in a bad mood when he got home. He had to let go of one of the accountants because he had seen too much. The new accounts Byron had created to take money from the pension fund and the company were ready to receive the funds. That guy Taylor from the accounting team almost discovered the hidden entries before Byron could erase them. Security had removed the shocked man from the building before he could look at the records. Taylor had some negative marks on his file, so his sudden exit wouldn't bother Byron too much. He just needed 2 days, and he would have a nice amount of money ready from his private estate in French Polynesia. Byron stood in the large entrance hall of his mansion and looked sadly at the portraits of his ancestors. Their serious faces seemed to be watching him and judging him. He was done with them. The Tafferty story ended with him. His son was a foolish drinker with no skills to carry on the family business. Candace had taken the life of the woman he loved, and Crystal seemed like just another self-centered person. With Ellie gone, Byron's whole life changed. Every plan and dream for the future became meaningless. She had been the one good thing in his life. Now that she was gone, everything came to a halt, forcing him to think again. Before that day, he had followed in his family's footsteps. He had worked hard for the business and the community. He didn't enjoy it, but he knew he had to do it. His father had taught him that lesson well. With the loss of the woman he hoped to grow old with, his role in the business and community felt empty. He decided to change his plan and put his own wishes before his duties to the business, the community, and even his family. He had married Missy to have someone attractive by his side at the social events he had to attend. She was decent, but he soon lost interest because they didn't connect. He had a child with her to keep her busy, although he didn't really want more kids since he already had 2, and it was Ellie who wanted them. For 20 years he had been working on his plan. It was carefully arranged, and he was just days away from moving funds from the employee pension plan as the package was about to mature. He intended to shift the money to a new investment platform. Instead, the funds would go into his own account in an offshore bank. At the same time, money from the company's cash reserves would go into another account. Then he would run away to a tropical paradise, free from the business, this dull town, and the family he considered burdensome. He sighed heavily. Soon. For now, he just wanted to have a drink and relax for a few minutes. As he entered the study, he was hit by the strong smell of something unpleasant. He saw an empty Scotch bottle on the floor, and his son's name came to mind, sparking anger that made him hurry into the room. He stopped when he noticed Crystal slumped over his chair, her head hanging off one side. She smelled of alcohol, and the floor next to her was a mess. Byron was fed up with her spoiled behavior. He lifted her skirt and pulled her underwear down. The sound of skin meeting skin shocked her from her daze. The second and third impacts brought her back to reality. "Ah!" she screamed. The noise only fueled Byron's anger, and he struck her harder, switching sides as he continued. "Daddy, please! Ah!" Crystal cried, and then became sick again. Byron held Crystal in her seat, raising his hand to strike her again for making more of a mess. Crystal's screams brought Missy rushing into the study, her housecoat and slippers hastily put on. She ran to Byron's side and grabbed his arm. "Byron, what are you doing?" she yelled in fear. He pulled his arm away from her grip and glared. "I should have done this a long time ago to stop her from being so spoiled. You give in to her too much." He slapped Crystal again, causing her to scream more before Missy, now alert, attempted to grab his arm again. Instead, she caught his hand across her face. She stumbled back, tripped over the empty bottle, and hit the liquor cart, which caused some glassware to fall and break. She ended up cutting her arm as well. "God damn it! Look at the mess you've made!" Byron shouted at Missy. Candace was just out of sight in the hallway, holding her cell phone to her ear. She heard a phone ringing, then someone answered. 911, what's your emergency? Candace had to pause before answering, remembering to keep her cool. "My dad is hurting Missy and Crystal. He knocked Missy down and there's blood. I think they're hurt." "Who's this?" "Candy Tafferty," she answered, hearing the operator quietly curse under their breath. "Okay, Candy, I'm sending ambulances and police to your address. Stay on the line." "Are you spying on Dad, Candy?" Cal shouted as he crept up from behind, snatched the phone from her hand and pushed her back against the wall, causing her head to spin. He peeked into the study and saw Missy lying on the floor, unconscious with blood on her clothes. "Is that blood?" "Sir, who am I speaking with?" the 911 operator asked. Cal glanced at the phone in annoyance, then hung up. He grabbed Candy by her hair and pulled her into the study. He tossed her phone onto the couch and pushed Candace down. As she fell onto the cushions, she managed to hide her phone in her pants. She looked up at Cal, who was inspecting Crystal. "Wow, she's really hurt. What did you use, a hammer?" Cal joked, looking at Missy as well. "That's a bad cut." Byron frowned, looking at his sore hand. Candace noticed his ring had turned, showing its rough side covered in blood. Sirens flashed blue and red outside, and Byron scowled. "What are they doing here?" he snapped at Cal. Cal raised his hands. "It wasn't me! It was Candy!" There was a loud knock at the front door, and Cal just stood there with a silly grin. "Go tell them to go away," Byron barked at him. "That's a cop! He won't listen to me," Cal protested. "Get the door! Do something for once and make them leave!" Byron yelled. Cal shot an angry look at Byron and left. Candace took advantage of the distraction to check on Missy. The cut on her arm was deep and still bleeding. She grabbed a fancy napkin from the floor and wrapped it tightly around the wound. She felt someone approaching from behind, and then everything went dark as a fist hit her in the head. The room spun as Byron dragged her away from Missy by her hair. She screamed in pain. "Are you pretending?" Byron sneered, leaning close. Candace looked up at him with wide eyes, feeling scared. This feeling was real. He seemed ready to hurt her again, and her head still ached from the blow. She needed him to believe her. "You're hurting me!" she cried in a small voice. He looked at her with doubt and then disgust. He let go of her hair with a sharp tug and turned to see a police officer standing in the hallway, looking uneasy. The officer stepped in to make space for two paramedics who were behind him. One went straight to Missy, while the other rushed to Crystal. Candace realized she needed to leave the house that night. If the paramedics were taking her stepmom and sister to the hospital, that was where she needed to be, too. She knew the police wouldn't keep her safe. As the officer talked softly to Byron, she quietly slipped away. She hurried up the stairs to her bedroom and changed quickly, right down to her clothes. Her head still hurt from earlier, and she wondered if she had a concussion. Grabbing her little Hello Kitty purse, she threw it over her shoulder and headed back downstairs. Hearing Byron and Cal arguing loudly, she rushed outside and climbed into the back of the ambulance where Missy was on a stretcher. The paramedic came to close the back door and noticed her. "No, Candy, you need to stay at home." She shook her head and winced in pain. The man frowned and climbed in. He took a quick look at her face where bruises were starting to show and checked her eyes. His expression changed as he assessed her condition. "Looks like he hurt you too," he said with concern. He shut the doors and called out to the driver, and they were off. The second ambulance followed behind, but the police stayed at the house. As they drove to the hospital, the paramedic glanced at Candace, who was leaning tiredly against the wall. "Did you help this woman with her injury?" he asked. She nodded slowly, wincing again. "You did a good job. You might have saved her," he said, and Candace gave a weak smile. When they arrived at the hospital, her headache worsened. She struggled to keep her eyes open. She was processed with Crystal and Missy, but since her injury was less serious, they took her to a waiting area to be seen. The emergency room was very busy, and ambulances were quickly sent back out. Candace overheard someone mention a serious accident nearby. Holding her head in her hands as pain pulsed, Nurse Stewart stopped to check on her. "Candace, dear, why are you still here?" Then she spotted the wristband on Candace's arm. "Oh, what happened?" "My dad hit me," she said softly, pointing to the side of her head. "He hurt Crystal and Missy, too." Margaret checked Candace's eyes and frowned. "It looks like you might have a concussion, but a doctor will confirm that." "Is it after my shift again, Margaret?" She smiled at the young doctor who entered the small exam room to perform the same tests she had. "Dr. Markle, why would I want your job when I have so much respect and authority?" He chuckled and nodded. "I agree with what you're saying. There's also a cut on her head near her hairline." He frowned. "Could it be from a ring?" He turned to Candace. "Who did this to you?" Candace looked at the doctor and then at Margaret, who nodded. "Daddy." "Why did he do that?" the doctor asked. "I put a napkin on Missy's injury to help stop the bleeding," she explained. The doctor glanced at the nurse, who added, "Missy is Candace's stepmother." The doctor pressed on. "How did Missy get hurt?" "My head hurts, and I'm so tired," Candace said. She didn't want to talk more because she felt bad about sharing in front of them. "We'll get you a place to rest, but we need just a bit more information," Markle said. Margaret frowned at him. "It's unlikely that what you hear will be helpful down the line. And remember who we're talking about?" The doctor looked away for a moment, then sighed and turned to the nurse. "Get her a room. We'll keep her here overnight for monitoring. I'll see if her stepmother wants to say anything." Margaret nodded and turned to Candace. "Please wait here. I'll find you a room." Candace closed her eyes, drifting in and out of sleep until someone finally arrived with a wheelchair to take her to a room. The next time she woke, she was in a hospital gown, resting in a bed. A nurse leaned over to speak to her. "We'll check on you a few times tonight just to be safe. You're okay now." Candace smiled up at her. Safe? The nurse didn't know. As long as her father was free, she wouldn't truly be safe. "Good morning, sleepyhead." Greg opened his eyes and smiled when he heard his mother's voice. His eyes widened when he saw both his mom and dad beside his bed. The curtain was drawn, and he was not alone anymore. "Dad, you're back?" he exclaimed. The man smiled and took Greg's hand. "Back? I may be a little tired from my trip, but I think I'm still in a hospital." Greg's mom rolled her eyes playfully and lightly tapped her husband's arm. "George, don't tease." She looked at her son. "How does your head feel today?" He smiled at her. "It feels much better. No pain at all. Does this mean I can go home?" "I think we'll get that decision later today," his mom replied, and he nodded. Greg frowned and glanced at his dad. "I thought you wouldn't be back for 2 more weeks." George smiled back. "Your mom told me how you were doing after the accident, and I wanted to help you during your first week at home. I'll work from home at night while still helping the team. Your mom can't take any more time off from her job." She gave a small protest. "It's true, Marion. Besides, we made great progress on the project, and we just need to finalize a couple of things. That won't take more than a week or 2. We're still ahead of schedule." Greg couldn't stop smiling, and his parents smiled back at him. From the doorway, they heard a woman crying. Greg's smile faded as the voice sounded familiar. He looked at his mother, who looked worried. "Is that Crystal?" he asked softly. Marion nodded. "I overheard some nurses while we were waiting to see you. There was an incident at the Tafferty's house last night. Byron hurt Crystal and she had to have surgery. Her mother did too. They are in the room across the hall. We're not sure what happened to her mother. Candace is in the next room with a head injury." "What kind of person hurts someone who is struggling?" Greg asked angrily. A lot of people are asking that. The trouble is, the man who hurt them is very powerful in this town, Marion replied. Greg's gaze went back to the door where he could still hear Crystal crying. He felt strange that he wasn't happy about it. I hope I can go home soon. I don't know how much more of that I can handle. I'm really upset with her. I'd be fine not speaking to her again, but I don't want to hear her in pain. His mother took his hand gently. You have a kind heart, Greg Hughes. He gets that from me, his dad added with a grin. Marion rolled her eyes but smiled at her son. Oh, I also heard the nurses saying Candace was a hero. She called for help and helped her stepmother when she got hurt. Greg smiled, thinking about how Candace would wave to him during her hospital rounds. She made him feel less alone. He looked forward to seeing her and hoped he could help her too. A young nurse came up behind his parents and caught their attention. Mr. Hughes is scheduled for a bath, then breakfast. That sounds great. Where should I lie down? George said playfully. Oh, George, you're impossible, Marion said, looking a bit embarrassed but smiling at the nurse. She turned back to Greg. We will come back when you're done. I'll also check on when you can go home. The doctor will check on him before lunch to sign the release papers, the nurse added. That's wonderful. Thank you, Greg's mom said as she gently moved her husband toward the door. The nurse smiled at Greg, who was shaking his head at his dad's playful side. It's nice that your parents visited. Greg's smile grew wider. Dad flew back from Germany, he exclaimed, feeling a bit silly right after. He glanced up at the nurse and saw her smiling at him. She seemed impressed and started to prepare for his sponge bath. I guess he must care about you, she joked. Greg snorted but couldn't help smiling back. The nurse looked happy with his response. She washed him with skill and care, making the experience feel very professional. As she worked, Greg's thoughts drifted to the bland hospital food that seemed to encourage patients to leave quickly. Really, Mr. Hughes? The nurse suddenly said quietly, pausing her work. He snapped back to reality and saw frustration on her face. What? She pressed her lips together and tilted her head to get him to look down. He obeyed and noticed she had moved to an uncomfortable spot. He looked at her puzzled. Sorry, what's wrong? Her expression grew even more serious. I take pride in keeping my patients comfortable, yet you're reacting? She whispered. What? No, I'm not, he insisted. She looked straight into his eyes. There's no need to lie, I can clearly see. Frustrated, Greg adjusted himself to show her it wasn't as it seemed. It's not like that. If it was, it would be more noticeable, he replied softly. Her cheeks turned bright red in embarrassment. I'm sorry, I didn't mean, I've just never seen a reaction like that before. And now you have. Can we just finish? He asked, feeling heat rise in his own cheeks too. She continued with her work, but her touches felt different, and Greg felt a growing awareness of what he had dismissed earlier. He cleared his throat to catch her attention. Are you done? He asked, as she gently moved the sponge again. He felt a change he couldn't ignore. Sorry, she managed to say, but her touch lingered. When she finished, he felt the awkwardness. He looked out the window, trying to calm himself as the situation became more noticeable. Each gentle touch from the nurse only served to add to his discomfort. The nurse closed his gown and gently pressed down to secure it. He tried to hold back an awkward sound and caught her amused look as she prepared to leave. Another nurse will bring your breakfast soon, she said cheerfully. Have a good day. Greg fidgeted with his sheets to hide the situation, hoping the next nurse wouldn't notice. When she came in, he saw her frown slightly as she moved a table closer. Too bad. Do you want me to adjust the bed? She asked, and he shook his head. Thanks, I'm fine, he replied quietly, and she left. After his first bite of food, he got his answer to the earlier question. Yuck! He couldn't leave soon enough. It was noon when his parents finally arrived to take him home. The doctor had come and left, and his mom entered the room with some clothes. Since the lower half of his left leg was in a cast, she had to cut off part of his favorite track pants, which made him a bit unhappy. An orderly came in with crutches and handed them to George. He lowered Greg's leg from the support it was resting on and pulled a curtain around them to help Greg get dressed. After adjusting the crutches for Greg and explaining how to use them, the orderly helped Greg into a wheelchair. He then passed the crutches back to George, who gave them to Marion since he planned to push the chair. They moved to the hallway together. When they got into the hall, Greg paused. He noticed the doorway across the hall where Crystal was. It was quiet now, likely because they had given her medicine. He then turned to his mom. "Can we check on Candace? I want to thank her for visiting." "Of course, sweetie," Marion replied with a kind smile and led them next door. "Just a moment," she said, and stepped inside. After a moment, she returned and waved them in. As Greg was wheeled into the room, he saw Candace for the first time. She was trying to cover her scars with her beautiful pink hair, brushing it back with her fingers. When he looked into her blue eye, he noticed she looked a bit nervous, so he decided to speak quickly. "Hi, Candace. I just wanted to say thank you for your visits. They really helped me feel better," Greg said. She nodded and glanced at his parents. "This is my mom and dad, Marion and George," he introduced. Candace nodded at them with a shy smile. "We'll wait outside for you, dear. It was nice to meet you again, Candace," Marion said gently as she guided George out of the room. Greg watched them leave, feeling a bit surprised. He had said what he wanted to say. Looking back at Candace, he noticed she was smiling more, seeming to enjoy his awkwardness. He struggled to find the right words, and then remembered what his mother had said this morning. "I heard what you did last night. It's amazing that you called for help and saved your stepmom. I'm really sorry you got hurt." "Thank you," she replied, and he nodded back. "I'm also sorry Crystal got hurt and your stepmom. That's terrible." He paused for a moment to collect his thoughts. "I don't really like Crystal right now, but I wouldn't want anything bad to happen to her." He felt a mix of sadness. When he looked up, he found Candace watching him closely. Her hair was neatly tucked back, and he was taken aback by how lovely she looked. His heart skipped a beat as he noticed her beauty. He looked down and swallowed hard, realizing how much pain he still felt after Crystal's betrayal. "You're not her boyfriend?" Candace asked carefully. He looked back up at her in surprise and shook his head. "No, not anymore. I don't have a girlfriend." "You could be mine," she suddenly said. Greg was so surprised that he almost laughed, but he stopped himself when he saw hope in her eyes. Instead, he smiled back at her. "I've just been rejected by your sister. My heart is still hurting from that. Just like I have to wait for my leg to heal, I need to give my heart time too. Besides, I wouldn't want anyone to think I was dating you just to get back at her. You deserve better than that." "You wouldn't do that," she insisted. He chuckled softly at her strong belief in him. "Thank you. You're right, I wouldn't." He sighed as he looked at her beautiful features. "Unfortunately, I don't think the adults would let us be together. We can talk about this another day once I've had time to heal. I should go with my parents now. My dad flew back from Germany to help me. He must be tired. Thanks again for checking on me. It really meant a lot." Candace nodded. Greg thought she looked a bit sad and frustrated, and he wondered why. He tried to move his wheelchair back, but got stuck. Looking back at Candace, he felt embarrassed when he noticed a strange expression on her face. She seemed different for a moment. Confused, he turned to the hallway. "Dad?" His father came into the room and helped get the chair unstuck. They waved at Candace as George wheeled Greg into the hall. His mom knelt down and looked him in the eye. "Would you like to see how Crystal and her mom are doing?" He shook his head. "Neither of us is ready to talk. Let's go home. Dad must be tired and I'm hungry for real food." Marion laughed gently and brushed his hair back. She then turned to her husband. "Let's go home, Papa Bear." George grinned. "Sure thing, honey bunny." Greg made a face. "Ow, pet names? I really didn't need to hear that." His parents laughed as they pushed him out of the hospital. Candace lay back against her pillow, nervous about how close she had come to ruining everything she worked for over the past 2 years. Her feelings for Greg surprised her. There was no doubt that she was drawn to him, so much so that she had tried to ask him to be her boyfriend. She rubbed her face with her hands and felt the scar running down her cheek. She remembered how Greg had looked at her when her face was bare. What she saw in his eyes was not disgust or discomfort. Instead, there was no sign of pity. What she noticed might have come from her own feelings. She saw a hint of longing in his gaze. She saw a longing in his eyes, but it was mixed with sadness. He was right. It was too soon after his breakup with Crystal. Then he mentioned how the older people were stopping them from being together. That's when she realized her mistake. In her wish for him, she had lost herself. She was acting too simple-minded, almost like a child. There was no way for him to be with her the way she wanted, not until she was ready to tell the truth. And then? Would Greg understand why? Would he forgive her? Could he? Care for her? Would anyone? Her cheeks felt wet. She realized she was crying. Her sobs came from deep inside, and her chest felt heavy. The room was blurry through her tears, and she struggled to breathe. She felt as if she might collapse. "Take it easy now." Warm arms wrapped around her, pulling her close to a soft shoulder. The fabric against her cheek felt stiff, and her panic started to fade. She was being rocked gently as soothing words washed over her. "You'll be okay. Everything will be fine." Finally, the voice registered with Candace. It was Margaret Stewart. She held on tight, trying to calm her breathing as the sobbing continued. She felt so alone. She had felt this way for a long time. When these good people learned of her secret, they would resent her, and she'd be alone again. That thought was almost too much to bear. She had grown to love their kindness and needed them desperately. "Candace, dear, slow your breathing. Take deep, steady breaths. Good girl." Margaret rubbed her back and held her close. Her voice was soothing, and Candace felt her panic start to fade. Soon she found her breathing again and began to calm down. Once she was breathing easier and no longer shaking, Margaret leaned back and held Candace's face in her hands. Brown eyes met blue, and she smiled. "Are you feeling better now?" Candace nodded, still unsure if she could speak. She shook slightly as she fought back her emotions. "Can you tell me why you were crying? What upset you?" the nurse asked gently. It took her a moment to find her voice, but she finally got one word out. It was enough because it was the truth. "Lonely." Margaret's eyes showed her understanding. "You're having a tough time at home, aren't you?" Candace nodded, gasping for breath as her chest tightened again. "Shh, take it easy now. Breathe slowly," Margaret instructed, and Candace did just that. She closed her eyes and focused on her breathing until she felt in control again. Tremors went through her body as the tension that had gripped her began to release. "I'm going to see if you can stay here another night. Since your father isn't home, you shouldn't be alone tonight," the woman said to her. Candace looked at Margaret, puzzled. "Where is he?" she asked. Margaret sighed in frustration. "He should be in jail for what he did to you three. Instead, the sheriff took him to meet his lawyer. They've been shut away together." She looked into Candace's eyes and nodded, noticing that Candace was holding steady. "Let me see what I can do." Candace took her hand. "Thank you." Margaret watched her for a moment to make sure she would be okay, then nodded and left the room. Candace's mind spun with the news that her father was still free after hurting them. She felt shocked, but also knew that it was unfair. She remembered his plan to leave his family, his job, and the town. She even knew the timing. Months ago, she had accessed his computer to find something to hold against him. She had read his messages and uncovered his scheme. He intended to steal the employee's pension money by changing the account details while it was being transferred. This change had gone unnoticed by the company until now. Candace had created an online storage space for every email and text related to her father's scheme. She had even recorded calls from his home office that mentioned it. Taking another risk, she had gone into his office and copied important documents. That's how she found out about the secret accounts. With the account numbers and access codes she discovered, she could alter his plan. Candace gathered every document she could find that also involved the sheriff and her father's lawyer, who were helping him for a cut of the money. The latest piece she added was proof that her father had manipulated the police to hide Cal's blood alcohol level after the accident that injured her. Her biggest fear today was that her father would silence her before she could reveal his wrongdoing. As the deadline approached, he was growing more unstable. If he found out what she was doing, there would be no safe place for her. Although Cal was also being set free by their father, she couldn't depend on him. He was just as cruel but lacked the cleverness to keep things hidden. She was on her own. Her father's plan was set to go into action soon, and he was becoming more reckless. Candace knew the sheriff and the lawyer might be keeping him calm to protect their own interests. She didn't have much time left to put her plan into action. She knew she couldn't stay in the hospital any longer. She needed to go back to her house and get her laptop. If only she had thought more clearly earlier, she would have brought it with her. After getting her laptop, she would need a safe place to stay away from her father and the sheriff. She would figure that out when the time came. Candace sat up. Her head throbbed, but it was not as bad as the night before. She had to get dressed and leave before the nurses returned. It felt like an accomplishment to stand up. She found her clothes from the night before in the closet and got dressed quickly, tucking her hair into her blouse to shield its color. Standing beside the door, she listened for a quiet moment outside, then slipped out and made her way to the stairwell. She took the stairs down to the ground floor. Leaving the hospital without being seen was easy. However, getting home would be more challenging. Then she remembered the old man who lived a block from the hospital. He fixed old bicycles in his garage and sold them. As she walked that way, she saw him moving his bicycles onto the driveway. Candace spotted a pink bicycle with white streamers and felt happy at the sight. It would be nice to ride that. "Hello, Candy," the man said with a big smile. She looked closer and realized he was one of the patients she had met at the hospital. He had a gallbladder issue. "Mr. Nash, how are you?" she asked. He seemed delighted she remembered his name. "Please, call me Bert. I'm feeling much better. It's nice of you to visit." Then he noticed the bruises on her face. "Oh my! What happened?" Candace almost said she fell, but decided to be honest. "Daddy punched me!" Bert looked shocked. "Why did he do that?" Taking a deep breath, Candace felt her chest tighten as the memory flooded back. "He hurt Missy and Crystal. I was trying to help Missy." Bert wrapped his arms around her, and she hugged him tightly, finding comfort in his kindness. He let her go and smiled. "You're not too hurt? Shouldn't you be back in the hospital?" She shook her head gently since quick movements caused pain. "I'm okay." Candace looked over at the row of bicycles and pointed at the pink one. "I'd like to buy that one." He grinned at the bicycle. "It looks like it was made just for you," he teased. She smiled and nodded. "Let me do something special for you. Because you listened to me complain, I want you to have it for free," he said as he brought the bicycle closer. Candace was taken aback. "You can pay." "No, I want you to have it. Please," Bert insisted kindly. She looked into his eyes and finally nodded in agreement. She hugged him again, feeling grateful. "Thank you." Bert's face turned slightly red from being pressed against her tall, curvy figure, but he kept his manners. "You're welcome," he replied. She looked at the bicycle, which had wider tires, upright handlebars that curved back, and a frame that made it easy to get on without swinging her leg over the seat. It has 7 speeds. You change them by turning the grip on the right. Gear 1 is for climbing hills, and Gear 7 is for speed on flat roads. Here are the hand brakes. The right side is for the back brake, and the left side is for the front brake. Use the right brake more often. Wait a moment. I think I have a helmet that will fit you. Bert went into his garage while Candace got used to the bicycle's controls. She adjusted the seat to make it more comfortable. "It's not pink, but yellow is nice too," Bert said as he brought out a bright yellow helmet. He placed it on her head and she bent down so he could tighten the straps. He stepped back and smiled. "You look great," he said cheerfully. She lowered her head, feeling shy. She didn't think she looked great, as the scars were a reminder of her past. "Thank you, and thanks for the bike." He nodded and she climbed onto the cruiser, riding down his driveway onto the sidewalk. She had ridden bikes when she was younger, but it had been years, so she felt a bit unsteady at first. However, the saying about how you never forget was true, and she soon felt more confident. The bike's wide and springy seat was comfortable, which helped, but she couldn't pedal too hard because her heart raced and made her head hurt. Candace rode through the neighborhood back to her home, keeping an eye out for her father's car or a police vehicle. The most intense part was the long stretch through the wooded area where large houses stood. Luckily, she didn't see anyone, and finally reached her driveway. Approaching the house, she noticed her brother's car parked by the front door. She rode around the side and leaned her bike against the wall. She placed the helmet on the seat and quietly moved to the back of the house. Looking through the windows, she didn't see her brother, so she unlocked the back door and let herself inside. The house was silent. She walked up the stairs to the second floor and carefully passed her brother's closed door to enter her bedroom. She grabbed a backpack and filled it with her computer, power cables, and the journals she had kept hidden. Then she added some clothes. She didn't hear her brother coming, so she was surprised when he suddenly pushed her roughly, sending her tumbling over her bed and crashing against the wall, landing between the wall and the bed. She winced from the pain in her back and shoulder from where she had hit. One of her legs was still on the bed, but she was slipping down into the small space beside it. Cal growled as he pulled on the bedpost, moving the bed further from the wall and making her fall even more. As she tried to get back onto the bed, Candace's hand touched something smooth. It was a dumbbell that she had dropped there a week earlier. Rough hands grabbed her ankle and yanked her back onto the bed as she turned to lay on her back. "You messed everything up!" Cal shouted, his words slurred. He pulled her further onto the mattress, and the smell of alcohol made her feel sick. He moved to sit on her body when she swung the 5-pound weight at his nose with both hands, using all her strength. He screamed and fell off the bed, hitting the floor hard. Candace quickly got to her feet and kicked him as hard as she could. He screamed again and curled up on his side. She dropped the weight, grabbed her backpack, and stuffed a few things inside. Then she stood over him. "You're the worst brother, and you'll always be a loser." He looked up at her in shock, seeing her anger and disappointment. She turned and left the room as he tried to say something, but all she could hear was him getting sick. Once outside, she put on her helmet and hopped on her bike, pedaling away from their house as fast as she could. She figured out the gears and started to go faster. She wanted to get away from this neighborhood right now. Before she reached the end of their street, she heard a shout behind her. "I'm going to get you!" She looked back and saw Cal stumble to his car, then heard the engine start. Fear shot through her, and she pedaled harder. There were few places to hide as she rode through the fancy neighborhood, where large homes had beautiful lawns, tennis courts, and pools, most of which were closed for winter. The Gordon family had a heated court and an indoor pool for swimming year-round. Candace pedaled as fast as she could, but she could hear Cal's Mustang getting closer, the loud engine roaring behind her. She knew she needed to find cover. Just then, as she searched for a way off the road, the Mustang sped out of the driveway, tires screeching as Cal drove wildly. Feeling him closing in, she turned onto the front lawn of the Gordons' house, which had terraced gardens running parallel to the street. The stone walls that made up the levels stopped Cal from following his sister onto the lawn, but he ran beside her, shouting from his car. She couldn't hear him over the noise of the engine. His tires hit the curb, and he swerved wildly before hitting the brakes hard. She sped ahead, but the sound of his engine showed she was not far enough away. She knew she would soon run out of shelter, as the terraces changed into a wide stretch of grass, so she pedaled faster and turned away from the road to ride deeper into the property. Ahead, she spotted a small creek with a bridge, and beyond it, a glass pool atop a small hill. She pushed herself hard towards the bridge. Cal's car roared as he drove over the curb, chasing his sister across the open grounds. The bike handled the bumps better than the car, which bounced and jumped. Cal struggled to keep control, his body shifting forward and back in his seat, making it hard to drive smoothly. He nearly caught her bike wheel, but then the car hit soft ground and veered sharply to the right. Candace felt her heart race as she sensed him right behind her. She crossed the bridge and turned left, picking up the gravel path that led back toward the road. Suddenly, she heard the Mustang's engine roar as it took off over the creek. She looked back just in time to see the car land and speed up the hill, crashing through the glass wall. Her bike tipped, sending her over the handlebars and into the bushes along the path. She heard shouting behind her. Dazed, she lay still for a moment, her head pounding in rhythm with her heartbeat. She felt sore from the fall, but it was the ache in her head that kept her down. When she finally found the strength to sit up and pull herself from the bushes, she was dirty and scratched, covered in leaves and twigs. Looking back at the pool house, she heard the sound of breaking glass from the damaged structure and muffled shouts from inside, but no one seemed to notice her. Cautiously, she picked up her bicycle and walked along the gravel path, limping from her scrapes. Once she reached the road, she climbed back onto her bike and slowly pedaled away until she was out of her neighborhood. She breathed a sigh of relief, glad her bike was still in one piece. She quickly turned left and right, navigating through the maze of the town, moving away from her neighborhood and toward another area. When she crossed the train tracks on Prentice Street, she remembered something a friend of hers, Crystal, had said about Greg living nearby. It made her wonder how anyone could manage high school. No. She quickly pushed away those negative thoughts. She didn't want to fall back into old habits. Eventually, she reached a small park and felt a chill as dark clouds began to gather. Looking up nervously, she thought it might snow. That made her think twice. She needed to find a place where she could access the internet. Time was slipping away, and she felt lost. The hospital had free internet in some sections, but she would stand out too much there. The library would be the same. Renting a hotel room was not an option. Everyone saw her as simple and naive. Candace felt all alone, with no friends or anyone to turn to. She fought back tears. Then a raindrop hit her nose, surprising her. A second drop landed on her forehead. She knew she had to find shelter. Just 5 minutes later, she stood next to her bike in a heavy downpour, sobbing. She didn't recognize where she was, but saw lovely homes in a neighborhood filled with cheerful families. At that moment, she felt more isolated than ever. "Candy, what are you doing out in this rain? Come inside before you get sick." Candace jumped at the sudden voice and looked up into the kind eyes of Greg's mother. Greg's father hurried over holding a big umbrella. Candace was shocked to see them. "Marion, get her inside. I'll take care of her bicycle," the man said kindly, handing Marion the umbrella. Marion took Candace's hand and gently helped her off the bike, while George held it steady. With an arm around her, Marion led her past 2 houses to a cozy ranch-style home. George followed, wheeling the bike into the garage. Inside, Candace found one of the coziest homes she'd seen. Marion helped her remove her helmet, her hands trembling from the cold. "You're freezing! George, get the bathtub filled with hot water!" Marion called as she took off Candace's backpack. George dashed away. "How did you get so dirty?" Marion asked softly, brushing twigs and leaves from Candace's hair. Looking into Candace's eyes, she asked gently, "Did you fall off your bicycle?" The warmth and caring in Marion's voice made Candace break down in tears. The stress of trying to escape her worries poured out. Marion wrapped her arms around her, and Candace held on tightly as the tears flowed and her body shook. "Mom, what happened?" Candace jumped in surprise when she heard Greg's voice from the other side of the room. "Go back to bed, Greg. Your friend had a small accident on her bicycle and got caught in the rain. I'll come see you in a moment," Marion told her son. Candace rubbed her blurry eyes to see better and noticed Greg's worried face before he awkwardly turned to leave with his crutches. As soon as he was gone, his father walked in. "The bathtub is filling." "Dear, please hang your dressing gown on the hook behind the door for after her bath," Marion said, and he left again. Marion untied Candace's shoelaces and helped her take off her sneakers. Then she guided her across the room into the hallway where the bathroom was. Marion took her husband's dressing gown, gave him a gentle push to leave, and closed the door. "Let's get you out of these wet clothes and check for any injuries," she said softly. They removed Candace's wet clothes, and Marion frowned a little at the scratches they found, but none were serious. Candace was surprised at how comfortable she felt with Marion, even though she was exposed. Then Marion helped Candace into the warm water. The bathtub was smaller than the one at her home, but the heat was soothing, and Marion's care made her feel safe, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Suddenly, Candace realized this was the last night she could pretend. Tomorrow, everyone would find out she had been lying. That thought made her feel very lonely and scared, and she began to cry. "Hey, it's okay, you'll be okay," Marion comforted her. "No, nothing will ever be okay again," Candace choked out, her sobs shaking her body. "Shh, just breathe, you're not alone," Marion said, but Candace shook her head between cries. "I feel so alone, and tomorrow, everyone will hate me." Marion knelt by the tub and gently stroked Candace's hair to calm her. "What do you think will happen?" she asked quietly. Candace looked at her with teary eyes and tried to steady her breathing. "Everyone will know I've been pretending." Tears continued to fall down her cheeks as she struggled to speak. Marion watched her closely while still holding her hand and brushing her hair. "What have you been pretending about, dear?" The brain injury," Candace admitted, trying to hide her face. Marion was taken aback for a moment but kept her calm voice. "Can you tell me why you did it?" Candace turned her face back to Marion and wiped her tears. "The night of the accident. I heard Daddy tell the doctor to leave the scars. He always disliked me. He wanted me out of his life." She looked into Marian's eyes. I didn't understand everything then, but I knew he was planning something. Terrible. He knew I was smart and was suspicious of me, so I had to leave. She looked down at the water. Pretending to be hurt was the only way I could think of to make him not send me away. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly to calm herself before going on. My dad still doesn't like me, but now I just make him feel sick. He ignores me otherwise. Her eyes grew wide with surprise. What surprised me most was how kind others were. I didn't expect that. She turned to Marian again. Before, I had no friends, I couldn't talk to anyone, and everyone was very cold to me because I was a Tafferty. I was awkward and became defensive, but mostly, I just felt so alone. Now people talk to me and smile at me. I learned how to listen and communicate better. I made friends. Her expression turned sad. But now, no one will want to be friends. No one will trust me. Marian touched her arm. I don't understand. Why did you want to stay in that house if he didn't like you? Candace wiped her face with the warm water in her hands. Then she looked at Marian. It took time, but I figured out my dad's plan. He wants to steal money from the employee fund. They're moving the plan tomorrow, but he changed the numbers to send the money to his account in another country instead. At the same time, he's moving the company's assets to another account he controls before he runs away to French Polynesia. His lawyer and the sheriff are helping him for a share. She looked directly at Marian. I have to stop him. How? Marian asked, surprised. I have proof. I'm going to make sure he gets caught. I want to protect the workers and the company. I have to do this. Her expression fell. But when I do, everyone will know I wasn't telling the truth about my condition. Tears returned as she thought about how lonely her life would be. She covered her face with her hands, not wanting to go back to how it was before. It's true. People will be surprised and hurt. Some might react badly to being deceived, but most will understand if you protect the people and the company, especially if you sincerely apologize for needing to do this, Marian said gently. Candace peeked at Marian through her fingers. I don't hate you, and you told me, Marian said with a smile. Candace shook her head. I've hardly talked to you. I've been lying to others for 2 years, she said sadly. It won't be easy. Apologize. Be patient. Understand that some may be hurt, but others will surprise you. Hold on to those friendships and accept that some may not forgive you, Marian said. There was a gentle knock on the door. Marian frowned at the interruption and turned to the door. Don't open that door unless you are ready for whatever comes next, she said firmly. Sorry, but the news is reporting that our guest is missing from the hospital, and there's been some very troubling news about her. Marian sighed and looked back at Candace, who was watching her with concern. You can stay here tonight. We won't tell anyone where you are. Candace seemed to feel better. We need to find out what's going on with your brother. He almost hit me with his car. He crashed into the neighbor's pool house, but I escaped after I fell off my bike. He had been drinking, but the sheriff isn't going to do anything, just like last time when I got hurt. Cal never has to face the consequences of his actions, Candace said sadly. Why would he try to hurt you? Marian asked, surprised. Candace looked away, her eyes watery. He blames me for our mother's death, just like Dad does. Marian shook her head in disbelief. That was not your fault. How can anyone be so cruel as to blame a child for something they didn't do? Candace felt overwhelmed by Marian's kindness and started to cry. She gasped when Marian kissed her forehead, then they hugged over the tub, Candace resting her head against Marian's chest. I'm sorry for everything you've been through. Remember, you're safe here with friends, Marian said gently, and Candace held on tightly while wiping her tears. A voice came from outside the door. Should I call someone? George Hughes, don't do that. Just wait until I come out, Marian replied firmly. Oh, okay. Marian held Candace's face in her hands, tilting it gently to look into her eyes. You relax in the tub, and when you're ready, there's a towel there for you. I don't have any clothes for you. My backpack, Candace said. Got it. I'll get that for you. There's also a robe you can wear. She pointed to the towel and robe. Take your time. I'll wash your wet clothes. Marian picked up the soggy clothing from the floor, smiled warmly at Candace, and left the bathroom. Moments Moments later, she opened the door just enough to set the backpack on the floor before leaving. Candace found herself alone in the cozy room. For the first time in a long while, she felt herself truly relax. She looked around at the pictures on the walls and the cozy decor. The warmth of the space and the hot water soon made her feel tired. The bathtub was small enough to keep her from slipping under the water, so she rested her head back and closed her eyes. She felt safe. Greg sat on the edge of the couch, stretching his leg out as he watched his parents talking quietly. "You know, I'm an adult now," he said. "I can join in adult conversations," he said with a hint of annoyance. They glanced at each other, looking a bit guilty. His mother nodded and came over to sit beside him while his father took a seat on his favorite chair. "Candace needs our help," his mother started. "Didn't the news say she's missing from the hospital?" Greg asked. His mom nodded. "She needed to leave because she has something important to do tomorrow." Greg felt puzzled. He couldn't think of anything Candy might be up to that would cause such concern from his mother. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm," she instructed. Greg's eyebrows raised as things started to feel even stranger. "Candace isn't what you think," she said. He frowned at his mom, not understanding. "What do you mean?" "She's been pretending since the night of the accident," his mom explained. Greg shook his head, suddenly thinking about how Crystal had disappointed him, his emotions boiling. "Like her sister?" he snapped. "No, not at all," his mother replied sharply, catching him off guard with her anger. Candace didn't do it for selfish reasons. She needed to protect herself from her father, who was making her life hard. She tried to make herself a legal dependent to keep from being thrown out. It sounds like her home life wasn't very good, with her father and brother treating her badly. "She must be really strong to handle all that," she insisted. "Shouldn't we contact the hospital?" George suggested. "No. No one can know Candace is here. Tonight, we are giving her a safe place to stay. Tomorrow will be a day to figure things out," their mother said firmly, locking eyes with her husband until he nodded. Then she turned to Greg, and he felt he had to agree. He had never seen her so passionate about something before. "Do you trust me?" she asked him plainly. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. His mother always told the truth, and she had a great instinct about people. Now he wished he had convinced Crystal to spend time around her so that she could have warned him about her selfishness. He realized he had been ignoring the signs regarding that beautiful woman. He was still confused about Candace's behavior, but he knew his mom was great at spotting trouble. He trusted her judgment. He sighed. "Where will she sleep?" he asked. His mom smiled proudly at him, and that felt nice. "Could she sleep in your bed?" she proposed, and he stared at her in surprise. "Not with you. You'd sleep out here on your father's recliner?" she added quickly. His dad chuckled as if he understood Greg's surprise. Greg shot him an annoyed look, which made his dad grin wider. "George set another place at the table for dinner." "That's Greg's job," the father complained. "Not while he's using crutches," Marion smirked. "In my day, we worked through broken bones." George sighed dramatically. "I took care of the cows, harvested the crops, fixed the fences, all while struggling to get around." His wife rolled her eyes. "You've never even broken a bone. The closest you've come to cows was seeing them on milk cartons, and the only crops you knew were the flakes in your cereal. Remember, I grew up on a farm, George." "Uh-ho. Full name alert, Dad. You might want to agree now to save yourself," Greg said with a smile. George huffed as he affectionately ruffled Greg's hair while heading to the kitchen to get utensils for their guest. His mother focused on Greg. "I changed your sheets this morning. You haven't messed up your room since you got home, have you?" Greg feigned shock. "How could I possibly make a mess in the 2 hours since I came back?" She laughed. "You've made a mess in less time than that." Pretending to be hurt, Greg responded, "Oh, you've wounded me, Mother. If you'll excuse me, I'll return to my room to make sure all my magazines are safely put away." His playful tone earned a chuckle from his mom, and his feigned irritation turned into a grin. Greg carefully stood up on his right leg and positioned his crutches. His mom stayed close to catch him if he stumbled. He looked at her. "I'm being really careful. Once I get better at this, I'll zip around the house." Marion chuckled and shook her head. She touched his arm gently. "I know you want to be active, But remember, you need to heal first. I know it's frustrating." "Yeah, I'm already feeling it," he said, frowning a bit. "Just be patient. I know you can handle this," his mom said, looking into his eyes. He nodded in response. She added, "Also, keep an open mind about Candace. What she went through was awful. She will need friends now more than ever since people will find out she was pretending to have trouble." Greg nodded, still a bit shocked. "That's hard to believe," he said softly before awkwardly making his way down the hall to his room. As he walked, he noticed the bathroom door and recalled meeting Candy there. The memory felt confusing now, which bothered him. In his room, he glanced around. He had been joking about those magazines. After all, that's what the internet was for, right? He felt a bit anxious about having a woman in his space. When Crystal first visited, she made a comment about a sock under his bed, and he didn't know what that meant at the time. It made him uneasy and took away some of the excitement of that day. He made sure to pick up his clothes from that day on. Thinking about his ex-girlfriend brought him down, so he tried to forget her, but then his thoughts turned to Candace. He remembered what she said the last time they met at the hospital. She wanted him to be her boyfriend. Was that true, or was she just trying to manipulate him? He closed his eyes and took a few deep breaths. He was right about one thing. He needed time to get over Crystal's betrayal. It still hurt a lot. Now, though, Crystal's older sister would be staying in his home. That made him a little uneasy, but he trusted his mother's instincts. He opened his eyes and looked toward the doorway. Candace stood there, looking nervous, hopeful, and maybe a bit anxious. Her pink hair was damp and she wore his dad's robe, which he found a little strange. One thing he couldn't ignore was how beautiful she was. He tried to forget about any scars as he admired her looks. How could anyone want to hurt her? But his heart reminded him that he had been misled by a pretty face before. He looked away, feeling the tightness in his chest at the memory. "I'm sorry." Greg almost missed Candace's quiet apology. When he looked back at her, he saw the shame in her downcast eyes. He moved a little closer and her gaze dropped even more. Without thinking, he reached out and gently lifted her chin to meet his gaze again. He noticed a spark of hope in her eyes. "I'm not upset with you. I was just thinking about what Crystal did. Mom told me you've been pretending to be someone else since your accident. She said you had a good reason for it. I haven't always trusted Tafferty women, but I believe in Mom's judgment, and she's on your side. So, I am too." Candace's face lit up with a big smile and a tear rolled down her cheek. He instinctively wiped her tear away, then his eyes widened as he realized what he had done. He quickly pulled his hand back, feeling his face warm. "Sorry, I think dinner's ready. Will you join us?" he asked, looking anywhere but at Candace. "Yes." He noticed she had a backpack. "You can put your bag here since you'll be staying over tonight. Too mean. I'll be on the recliner," Greg stammered, feeling his face almost catch fire. Candace giggled at him, her eyes sparkling. He stepped back to let her in. "I need to get dressed," she said softly. Greg nodded and pointed toward the hall. "We'll be in the dining room." He quickly left, only realizing the door shut behind him when he reached the washroom. His mom looked up when he entered, raising her eyebrows at his flushed face. "She's just too pretty," Greg muttered before he could stop himself. Marion smiled at her son. "I don't know if she's too pretty, but she is very nice." Greg felt a pain in his leg and winced a bit, but his mom noticed. "Take your seat. Dinner is ready," she said, gently patting his arm. He nodded and sat down in his chair, feeling a bit better right away. "Is it time for your next pill?" Marion asked. "I'll wait until after dinner. I'm not sure how long I can stay awake," Greg admitted, feeling tired. His mom ran her fingers through his hair kindly, then went back to the kitchen. His dad came into the dining room and sat down with a smile for Greg. "Looks like we have a lovely guest. I know you'll be polite while she's here," he teased quietly. Greg glanced at the doorway, then shot a look at his dad. "Of course." "Don't tease him, please," Marion said as she entered with their plates. She set them down and gave her husband a serious look before heading back to the kitchen. Candace appeared in the doorway, looking a bit shy. Greg turned his head and was surprised by her outfit. She wore a pink shirt and a short skirt. He opened his mouth, but no words came out until he cleared his throat. "Please take a seat," Greg said, pointing to the chair across from him. She smiled and sat down. Greg noticed his father's face was a bit red, too, likely because of how Candace looked. His mom came back with more plates. She noticed the expressions on the men's faces and understood. Then she set a plate in front of Candace before taking her own seat. "Is the house warm enough for you, Candace?" she asked, noticing that Candace seemed a bit cold. Candace looked at Marion and nodded slightly. "I rushed when I packed, so I didn't grab warm clothes," she replied softly. Marion turned to George and Greg. "Start eating." She stood and gestured for Candace to follow her. They left the room, and Greg exchanged a look with his dad, who tried not to smile. "That's quite a situation for you, kid," George said quietly, giving in to the urge to tease his son. "Dad?" Greg said, surprised, and turned to start his meal to distract himself. A few minutes later, his mom returned with Candace following her. Greg's eyes widened again when he saw her black leggings with flames. She still wore the pink shirt, but had put on Greg's black running jacket, which didn't fully close but covered her a bit more. She looked warm. Who was he kidding? She looked great. His mom noticed his surprised expression and raised an eyebrow. "You won't be using your running outfit for a while, and it's nice and warm," Marion said firmly. He jumped a bit when he looked at his mom. "No, it's just fine." Candace's worried smile turned into a happy one as she watched him. They all sat down, and Greg tried to focus on his meal. He noticed how good Candace looked in his favorite outfit. Now he wished he had chosen something more comfortable for himself, as he was feeling quite uneasy in his loose pants. They kept the conversation light, but Greg struggled to concentrate. His leg hurt, he felt tired, and Candace was so close by. He winced when pain shot through his leg and his mother stood up. "I think it's time for you to take your medicine, then you can relax in the recliner," she said. He nodded and pushed himself back from the table. When he looked up, he saw concern in Candace's eyes. He forced a smile, carefully got up, and went to the bathroom to brush his teeth. After that, he returned to the living room. His mother was nearby as he sank into the recliner and sighed with relief. Marion handed him the pill and a glass of water. He took it willingly, then leaned the chair back to stretch out. His mom covered him with a blanket and kissed his forehead. "Thanks, Mom," he said, feeling sleepy. "Sleep well, Greg." She watched him close his eyes before going back to the dining room. Candace looked tired too, but Marion had some questions. "Who are you going to report this to?" she asked. Candace looked back at Marion. "I've found an agent in the FBI who handles these cases. I will give him all the evidence I've collected and let him know what will happen. The transfer is set for 10 in the morning, but the money won't stay in the accounts your dad made. I've set up new accounts to make sure the funds go back to the pension and the company. Your dad won't have access to these new accounts. I'll notify the investment firm about them once the transfer is done. When your father finds out the money is missing, he might react badly. And with the sheriff involved, he may be looking for you. I think we need to take some precautions," Marion said, and Greg looked worried. "We should call in the state police," he suggested, and Marion agreed. Candace smiled at them, trying to fight off a yawn. "And that's your cue to get some rest, young lady," Marion said kindly. Candace smiled back. "I'm sorry for bringing you into this. I just don't have anyone else." Tears filled her eyes. Marion moved closer and hugged her gently. She whispered soothing words and kissed her gently on the forehead, making Candace smile. "Come on now, you. Get some rest, and we'll handle everything in the morning," Marion said gently but firmly. Candace nodded and allowed herself to be led down the hall to Greg's room again. "We'll see you in the morning. Sweet dreams," Marion added. Candace managed a small smile and a nod, feeling too tight in her throat to say anything. Once the door was closed and the room was lit by a soft desk lamp beside the bed, Candace looked around. This was the first boy's room she had ever stayed in. She breathed in and noticed Greg's warm scent, which sent a little thrill through her. After pushing back a yawn, she walked to the bed and pulled back the cover to lie down. Her body was a bit sore from falling off the bike, but the hot bath had helped. She tucked herself under the covers, taking in the fresh, soft sheets. They smelled good, but the comforter still carried Greg's scent. If she weren't so tired, she might have been tempted to explore a bit, but she didn't want to mess up his sheets. Instead, she closed her eyes, feeling warm and safe as she drifted into a deep sleep. After a restless night, Byron's mood grew heavier. Doubt was new to him, But with the funds transfer deadline approaching, he couldn't shake the uneasy thoughts. It was too late to change the transfer, and even checking the accounts could raise suspicions. He held back from making any sudden moves. He had been very careful, but it was the first time a member of the Tafferty family had stolen from their own company. This troubled him deeply. "Byron! For goodness sake, lighten up! You're making me anxious and the situation is tense enough," said Byron's lawyer, Preston Mathers. Just then, Sheriff Todd Winslow walked in, looking serious. Preston turned to him in confusion. "What's going on with you?" Ignoring Preston, the sheriff faced Byron. "Your son has died." "What?" Byron said in shock. Todd continued. He lost control of his car and crashed onto the Gordon estate, barely making it out of the car before drowning. He also hit Hal Gordon's wife, Belinda, while driving through the wall. She's in the hospital with some broken bones. Fortunately, she survived. Hal is very upset. Byron's mind raced. The timing felt too strange. He would be expected to stay for the funeral, and he had plans to leave today. Thoughts of his son driving recklessly filled his mind. He knew Cal struggled with drinking, but this was too much. The sheriff added, "We still can't find your daughter. She left the hospital yesterday and has vanished." Where would she go? Byron turned to the man beside him. "Like I know what goes on in the mind of someone simple." "It's time," the man said firmly. Byron and Todd looked at Preston, who was pointing to his gold watch. Byron shot a condescending look at the sheriff, opened his laptop, and went to check his offshore accounts. He logged in and clicked on the summary page. He felt relief wash over him as he saw the account balances. One was from his pension, and the other was his business funds. A smile spread across his face. He was very wealthy. He shared a smile with his partners, who looked relieved too. "Now it doesn't matter what happened in the Gordon's pool, does it?" Byron said with a smirk. Todd chuckled in agreement. Preston was looking at the screen with worry. "Byron! The money!" Byron frowned at Preston's shocked face and quickly looked back at the screen. His smile vanished as the balances now showed 0. "What?" He refreshed the page, but it still didn't show any funds. He stared blankly at the screen for a moment, then tried logging in again. This time it said his password was wrong. He double-checked and typed it slowly, but still received the same message. "What is going on?" Todd shouted at Byron, whose face was turning red. "I can't access my account," Byron said, his voice shaky as he tried to figure out what was happening. "I didn't put up with your nonsense for all these years to be cheated on the day I was due to get paid. I want my money," the sheriff yelled angrily. Byron snapped back. "The money is gone! Someone took it!" Todd laughed harshly. "I don't believe you. You've planned this to keep it all to yourself," he accused, pulling out his gun and aiming it at Byron. "You need to give me my money now." "I can't get into the account," Byron replied sharply. "You have personal accounts, and my fee just doubled to $5 million. Get to your bank and send the money," Todd said firmly. Byron, feeling frustrated, logged into his bank website only to find out that his accounts had been frozen. He was instructed to visit the branch to sort it out. Shock crossed his face. "Unbelievable," he murmured quietly. "Don't you dare tell me there's no money," Todd yelled. "Calm down, Todd. Just relax," Preston said, raising his hands to try to ease the tension. As Preston stepped between Todd and himself, Byron pushed the lawyer into Todd. The sudden movement startled Todd, causing him to fumble. Byron followed up his punch with a kick, causing Todd to drop the weapon. In a quick move, Todd grabbed a lamp and hit Byron in the face, pushing him back. Blood trickled from a cut on Byron's forehead. Preston fell to the floor, holding his stomach, but he landed on the gun as Todd knelt to pick it up. He pushed the hurt lawyer aside as Byron ran away. "Call an ambulance," the lawyer struggled to say to Todd. The sheriff thought about doing something drastic. "You can call yourself." He rushed out of the room after Byron. He wasn't going to let Byron cheat him. Preston lay on the floor trying to breathe. The pain in his stomach was intense, but his anger gave him the energy to reach his desk. He grabbed the phone and called 911. "Hampstead Hills Emergency Services. What's your emergency?" the operator asked. "I've been hurt. Send an ambulance, Preston Mathers, 17 Oak Lane." "Sheriff shot me," he managed to say. "Stay with me, Mr. Mathers. Help is on the way. Is Sheriff Winslow still there?" Preston felt weak. "No chasing Byron, he's dangerous." Stay with me, Preston. Help is coming, Preston. In the bright and warm kitchen of the Hughes home, Candace sat between George and Marion as they watched money move into Byron's offshore accounts, then transfer to accounts Candace had made. She then reset her father's password to lock him out. At the same time, George was on the phone with the FBI agent Candace found to help take down Byron. The agent was surprised to receive so much evidence. He got the bank to freeze Byron's assets since they had his banking details. Marion was on the line with the state police, reporting that the local sheriff was involved in a plan to take money from the mining company. Candace had already sent them a link to her evidence. They were sending units to Hampstead Hills to investigate and to question Sheriff Winslow. Candace glanced across the table at Greg, who was watching her with a small smile. She noticed he was on pain medication since his eyes looked a bit glassy. He had woken up in pain from sleeping in the chair. She felt sorry for him. "What's up?" she asked. "I'm just glad your smart mind is okay," he replied with a sigh. Candace felt her cheeks turn warm as he continued to look at her. Marion heard him and gave him a closer look. "Papa, our boy is a bit loopy from the medicine." George looked over and sighed. "Yep, he's also a little smitten." Candace's eyes drifted to her father, who was smiling at his son, whose blush was as red as hers. Marion looked at her husband. "Don't tease Greg." Candace turned to Marion. "I need to call Mr. Bagley at the investment house that takes care of the employee pension fund. He might be worried since the funds haven't been transferred into the new pension plan yet." Marion nodded, and Candace dialed the number. After letting it ring 6 times, she heard a noise as the man fumbled the phone. "Hello?" he said, sounding short. "Mr. Bagley, this is Candace Tafferty." "Candace? Oh, Candy! This isn't a great time to talk. Daddy took money from the employee pension fund, so you didn't get the funds for the new package." There was silence on the other end. Then, Candace heard some gasping, so she hurried on. "It's okay. I made sure he couldn't take the money. It's ready to be put into the new account. Can I confirm the account number with you?" she asked. "Who is this?" he said. "It's really me, Mr. Bagley. Can I read you the account details?" she said. They said, "I know. I'm really sorry. I had to pretend so I could find out what Daddy was planning. I had to stop him." "My goodness. You really have the pension funds?" he asked, sounding hopeful. "Yes, sir." "Can I confirm the account?" she asked again. Yes, please," he rushed. Candace slowly read the numbers, and when she finished, she heard him sigh. "That's right, Candace. I'm transferring the funds now," she said, and started the account-to-account transfer. Soon, her screen showed that her pension fund balance was 0. "It's done!" After a moment of silence, several people gasped in relief. "Thank you, Candace. I don't know how you did it, but thank you. What started as one of the worst days is now much better," Bagley said. "I'm happy to hear that. Now I need to call Mr. Stevens since Daddy also took money from the company. That needs to be returned as well." "How could he do this?" the man asked angrily. "He was planning to leave for an island in French Polynesia. I canceled his flight tickets too. He can't go because the FBI wants to talk to him." Mr. Bagley laughed. "You are amazing, Candace. Thank you again." "You're welcome. Goodbye," Candace said and hung up, smiling broadly at Marion. "That feels good, doesn't it?" her mom asked. "Very good. I'll make the next call." She found it harder to get Mr. Stevens to listen. He was upset when he found out they had no cash in the bank. She carefully explained what happened and transferred the money back into the account. After he saw the correct balance, he became much friendlier. Candace sighed. "The company needs a new policy for handling these transactions. Even someone like a Tafferty shouldn't be able to take that much money without proper approvals," Candace suggested. "But it's Byron's company," Mr. Stevens said. "Not for long," Candace replied. "Good day." Candace leaned back and relaxed. George was speaking softly with their FBI contact. After hanging up, he smiled at the group. "A team of investigators will be here later today." "What's left to do?" Marion asked. "I'd like to visit the hospital to see how Missy and Crystal are," Candace replied, looking at Marion. "I think we should wait until the authorities have gathered the sheriff, your father, and his lawyer. They don't know where you are right now, and it's safer that way. Missy and Crystal are secure at the hospital, and I'll call to get an update on their condition. Does that sound okay?" Marion suggested. Candace smiled and nodded. "Please ask for the head nurse, Margaret Stewart," she said. Marion put her phone on speaker, dialed the hospital, and requested Margaret. The call was forwarded, and Marion heard the head nurse's voice, which sounded a bit distracted. "Nurse Stewart speaking." "Hello, this is Marion Hughes. We brought our son Greg home yesterday," Marion began. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Hughes, is everything okay with Greg?" the nurse asked, sounding concerned. Marion appreciated her caring tone. "Yes. Well, he had a rough night, and we gave him one of his medications this morning. He seems to have a lot of energy now," Marion admitted. "If they're too strong, you can split them," the nurse suggested. "Pharmacies have tools to cut pills safely." "Thank you, we'll try that," Marion replied. "Is there anything else?" the nurse asked, returning to her distracted tone. "I wanted to check on how Missy and Crystal are doing," Marion said, and Candace leaned in closer to hear. Margaret sighed. "I'm afraid I can't give out any details to anyone but family." "Oh, please tell me," Candace urged. Marion shot her a cautious look. "Candy, is that you?" Margaret asked urgently. "Yes, I'm safe, but please don't tell anyone where I am," Candace said with an apologetic look towards Marion. "Why? What's going on?" the head nurse pressed. "My father misused the company funds, and I stopped him from taking the money. I informed the FBI, and you need to keep Missy and Crystal safe from him and the sheriff. They are going to be very upset," Candace explained nervously. "You sound different," Margaret replied, a bit uncomfortable. "I'm really sorry I had to pretend to be someone I'm not. It was the only way I could stay close to him and find out his plans. I'm truly sorry." "You were always so kind to me," Candace said, her voice shaky as tears filled her eyes. "Easy now," Margaret said gently. "When this is all over, we need to have a long talk." "Yes, I would like that," Candace replied, trying to calm herself. There was a short pause. "I'll ask one of our security staff to keep an eye on your mom and sister. They're both recovering and will be with us for a few more days." "Thank you," Candace replied. "I need to check on my patients. I'll talk to you later," Margaret said, then ended the call. Marion hung up and looked into Candace's eyes. No more calls until the culprits are caught. Candace nodded. She hoped they would be caught today. She really wanted to talk with Margaret. Byron hurried into his family home. He glanced at the portraits of his ancestors lining the walls. They seemed to be watching him with disapproval. Forget them! He rushed to his office, knowing he was short on time. The knife he had used on the sheriff's tire would slow things down, but he knew Winslow would arrive soon. He needed to grab the cash from his safe and his travel bag before leaving town. Something had gone wrong with his plan, but he would figure it out later. As he opened the safe, he froze. He remembered putting $20,000 in there a week ago. Then he recalled that Cal had been in his office when the safe was open, trying to convince him for more allowance. That careless kid must have taken the money while he wasn't looking. He grabbed his handgun and a box of bullets from the safe and tucked them into his jacket. Cal might have hidden the stolen money in his room. The boy was not very bright after all. Grabbing his travel bag, he dashed up the stairs. He noticed a stain on the steps and realized it was blood. Had Cal been injured when he left the house? As Byron walked down the hall toward Cal's room, he spotted more blood near Candace's bed. He stepped inside, hoping to find bad news, but saw that the mattress was askew, with a large blood spot and some mess on the floor. Nearby was a small weight, stained with blood. Candace had been here. She must have fought with Cal, and won. A picture formed in his mind of what had happened, but he didn't have time to think about it now. He quickly searched Cal's room for his money. After finding only a few wrinkled bills, he stuffed them in his pocket and hurried down the hall. "Byron!" He pulled out his gun and fired toward the front door as he turned and ran for the back. Winslow shouted in anger and fired back, but the bullet hit the doorframe as Byron ducked through. He shot again before bursting through the patio door. He ran around the side of the house, expecting Todd to suddenly appear, but he didn't. Just as Byron reached his car door, the sheriff appeared at the front entrance. Byron shot at him again. Todd yelped and stumbled back inside as the bullet grazed his thigh. Byron jumped into his car and started the engine. He shot at the door again while Winslow tried to peek out to aim his weapon. Sirens were getting closer, so Byron drove onto his lawn and headed toward the fence on the far side of his property. There was a path behind it, and he planned to use that to escape the neighborhood. A bullet shattered his back window when the sheriff made a lucky shot. Byron then aimed his car at a fence panel between two posts and crashed through it. He turned the wheel quickly to get back on the narrow path and sped away. He knew he needed to find another car since his was now too noticeable. He was on the move with no money to start a new life. "This is a mess," Todd yelled in anger, then limped to his cruiser as 3 state trooper cars pulled into the driveway. In his frustration, he fired at the first car without thinking. The 3 cars spread out and skidded to a stop, blocking his way. Feeling scared, he rushed to his car to grab his shotgun, but as soon as he pulled it out, a bullet hit his shoulder and made him spin. The gun flew out of his hand. Before he knew it, 3 state troopers had him pinned to the ground, taking away his remaining weapons. They flipped him over and put handcuffs on him. "Suspect detained. Medical help needed," one officer said into his radio. "Byron, Tafferty, escaping," he managed to say while hurting on the rough ground. "You let us handle that. You're in trouble now," a younger officer replied with a smirk. Todd slumped on the ground. It wasn't fair. After years of dealing with Byron's problems, he felt trapped. Byron had always helped him stay in office by ensuring he was re-elected. The last few years had been the worst, and this was his reward? What a nightmare. As 10 o'clock arrived, the FBI agents finally began to pack up and head to their cars. They had spent the afternoon talking to Candace in the Hughes living room, going over everything she had recorded about her father's wrongdoing and how she had stopped him. The money that had moved from the company accounts into Byron's personal ones was clear evidence of his crime. Candace's actions to move the money back into the right accounts didn't change what Byron had done since he didn't know about her efforts. The messages she collected between Byron and his lawyer detailed the plan, which ended with the money going into Byron's offshore accounts. It was believed he would later transfer the shares for the sheriff and his lawyer, but the money was gone before he could. Agent Lewis Jefferson was the FBI investigator Candace chose, and the last one still at the house. The other agents had taken down the lights and cameras used for her statement and packed away their equipment. "Thank you for all your hard work in reporting your father's crime," he said on behalf of the FBI. "I'm really sorry for what you went through, but it shows what a strong young woman you are," Lewis said, as he shook her hand. Candace smiled back at him in gratitude. "I understand that Sheriff Winslow is in custody, and your father's lawyer, Preston Mathers, died in his home after being shot. Your father is still missing, but there is a statewide alert out for his arrest. We know he might be dangerous, as he and the sheriff exchanged fire at your home. We want to take you into protective care until he is caught. You are an important witness," the agent said seriously. Candace looked at Marion and George, who both nodded. "I think that might be a good idea," Marion said, "just until it's safe." Candace stepped forward and hugged Marion tightly, whispering in her ear. "Thank you for believing in me when you had every reason to doubt." Her voice trembled with feeling. Marion hugged her back and smiled. "My instincts have always been spot on. I knew you were trustworthy. You can come back as soon as it's safe. Greg will be missing you." Candace felt a rush of warmth at the mention of Greg and smiled shyly at Marion. "Can I say goodbye to him?" Marion had asked Greg to rest in his bedroom when she noticed he was getting sleepy after lunch. "Yes, just keep it calm, as he's still recovering," Marion said, locking eyes with Candace. Holding back a grin, Candace nodded and turned to Jefferson. "I'll go with you, but I need to say goodbye to Greg first. Can I stop by my house to pack a suitcase?" "That's fine. I'll be outside making plans." He turned to her parents. "Thank you very much for looking after Miss Tafferty." "It was our pleasure. After all, she's like family," George said proudly, grinning. Marion playfully nudged him, and he feigned surprise. "What? It's obvious!" Marion rolled her eyes at George's joking as Candace hurried down the hall, her heart racing with excitement. She took a few deep breaths and knocked lightly on Greg's closed door. Hearing a sound, she opened the door and stepped inside. She walked closer to the bed and noticed Greg was asleep. She frowned, thinking she heard him mumble something. The blinds were drawn, but the lamp next to the bed was on. In the soft light, she could see his eyes were shut. She also noticed he was adjusting the sheets. Candace. Was Greg dreaming about her? She wasn't sure what to do. She didn't want to wake him or make him uncomfortable, but she really wanted to say goodbye. It felt too risky. She didn't want him to doubt her trustworthiness. That would be terrible. She turned to leave, but the door handle made a noise. Ma? What? She turned and saw him looking at her, blinking sleep from his eyes. Candace, what are you doing? He asked. The FBI is going to help me for a while. I wanted to say goodbye. What, wait, you're leaving? He said, sitting up fast. She moved closer to him to calm him down. Just until they catch my dad. I will be back. He took a breath. Oh, that's good. I would like that. Me too, she said with a smile, and he watched her closely. She wanted to kiss him, but she was scared it might push him away. Then he leaned in and lightly touched her lips with his. It felt amazing. The first kiss was soft and shy, but the second took her breath away. He kissed her sweetly, and she made a little sound of surprise. He pulled back, looking into her eyes. You aren't just joking around, are you? She could see the hurt in his gaze from someone else who had hurt him. No. I really want you to be my boyfriend. I want to be with you. I want to know everything about you. I want to share everything with you, she said eagerly, placing her hand on the bed. He gasped in surprise, his eyes wide. I wouldn't hurt you, I promise. Greg kissed her again, and she leaned against him, feeling a rush of excitement. He wanted her, too. There was a knock on the door. Greg pulled back so they could catch their breath. He looked into her beautiful blue eyes. You're my girlfriend. I'm your boyfriend. I will wait for you, he said, holding her gaze. It's all I've ever wanted, she replied with a big smile. I should go. Your mom told me not to be too excited, but that's hard. Greg smiled and nodded a little. I feel the same way. Candace stood quickly and walked to the door, then looked back. Greg was still looking at her, and she felt a strong sense of wanting. Come back to me soon, Candace, he said, his voice filled with emotion. That made her pause, and she nodded, unable to find her voice. She stepped outside and saw Marion leaning against the wall with a kind but knowing smile. Candace nodded to her before they walked to the front door, where she gave her and George a quick hug. Then she followed Agent Jefferson to the SUV. As she settled into the back seat, she glanced at the agent in front. They better find my dad soon. For Greg, winter moved slowly as he healed. He attended classes online, with his friend Tim helping him use a tablet to connect through video. Spring came, promising warmth, but instead bringing cool weather, rain, and gray skies. He was well enough to return to school, but it was tiring. He felt thankful when the cast finally came off, even though Tim teased him about the pink cane he used. It was a gift from Candace, and he held it with a smile. Candace was still in protective custody, and there was no news about Byron. The legal case against him was slow, keeping Candace from coming home. They had weekly video calls to learn about each other, but instead of making them feel better, the calls only made them want to be together more. Over the next 2 months, Greg slowly regained his strength. When summer came, the sun shone, the days grew warmer, and Greg was well enough to start running again, though he took it easy at first. Tim ran with him as graduation approached. Pete said Valerie is being difficult. He asked her to the prom, but she hasn't said if she'll go with him. Greg chuckled. You asked Heather, right? The day they announced the date, Tim replied with a grin. Greg smiled back. Tim looked at him curiously. Any news from Candace? Greg frowned and shook his head. I asked her last time, and she said she'd try to make arrangements, but I haven't heard anything since. Tim gave him a sly smile. I heard Crystal doesn't have a date. Come on, don't bring that up, Greg said, quickening his pace. Tim laughed, struggling to keep up. Hey, I was just joking. They ran in silence for a while until Tim spoke again. Heather feels really bad about how things went between you two. She's sorry. Greg glanced at his friend, noticing the awkward look on Tim's face. He figured Heather had asked him to say it, but he knew Tim cared about her and wanted to keep things friendly. He sighed and nodded. Tell Heather it's okay. I'm not upset with her, he said, then smiled at Tim. But I expect to be your best man when you two get married. Tim stumbled in surprise, causing Greg to slow to a walk and take a break. Tim looked worried. What, I haven't told anyone I plan to ask her? Greg chuckled. Please, it's obvious. You two are so in love. Wedding bells are coming for you. Tim looked at Greg's smiling face and relaxed. Does anyone else know? He asked, clearly anxious about Heather finding out before he could pop the question. I doubt it. Most folks around here don't pay attention to others. I'm just a bit of a romantic, so I can see the signs." "Mr. Romance," Tim teased. "When are you going to ask her?" Greg asked. Tim paused, thinking. "I was planning to do it after graduation. We were going camping and—" He stopped when he noticed Greg's disapproving look. "Is there anything stopping you from asking sooner?" Greg pressed. No. I have the ring." "Don't you think Heather would love to share this news with her friends at prom and before graduation when everyone goes off on their own paths?" Greg asked. Tim paused, realizing Greg was right. Heather would enjoy that. "Wow, I didn't think of that. You really know how to be romantic." Greg shrugged with a pleased smile. They turned and headed back. As Tim returned to his thoughts about how he'd propose later, he noticed that Greg didn't look happy. He suddenly understood that Greg's earlier comment about people being unaware also included him. He felt bad for not noticing how his friend felt. "I really hope Candace can come to prom." Greg looked at Tim in surprise and noticed the concern on his friend's face. He smiled. "Thanks, Tim. So do I." Everling's banquet hall was decorated beautifully for the night. The graduating class wore lovely party dresses and neat suits, and the music was already inspiring some guests to dance. For many, this was a chance to show how great they looked and how ready they were for the future, even if they were still young. Many would be heading off to college, some far away, so tonight was also about saying goodbye. Tim and Heather were surrounded by their friends. Heather was radiant as she showed off her sparkling engagement ring. No one was surprised, but everyone was thrilled to see it happen. The football team was there, some looking a bit awkward in their rented suits, but their dates made up for it by looking stunning in their dresses. The ladies seemed to shine even brighter next to the boys in ill-fitting black suits. When Crystal Tafferty arrived, everyone could see she looked beautiful. Her green dress sparkled under the lights, drawing attention. Sadly, not everyone watching was smiling. The Tafferty name had suffered lately because of Byron's problems. Many people could have faced tough times because of that one mistake. Families could have lost jobs and savings, and some kids might have worried about not being able to go to college. Crystal faced judgment because of her connection to Byron, even though she had nothing to do with his actions and was hurt by them. Then there was her past with Greg, which the school knew all about. It had become a well-known story, much to Greg's embarrassment. Tim noticed the redhead near the entrance looking more and more uncomfortable with the unfriendly looks she was receiving. He sighed, getting ready to help her, but then he froze. Standing at the entrance was a sight in pink. Tim heard Heather gasp softly as she spotted Candace Tafferty as well. The tall woman wore a dress that hugged her shape and showed a bit of her neckline, though some of it was covered by her soft pink hair. Tim smiled as Greg walked into the hall and stood next to Candace. He wrapped his arm around her back, and she smiled at him shyly. They shared a sweet kiss, showing everyone they were together. Greg wore a very stylish suit that looked much nicer than the ones his friends had on. It fit him just right. Tim knew from their runs that Greg's leg was healed, and he was getting back in shape. The couple moved further into the hall, surprising everyone as they stopped next to Crystal and smiled at her. When Greg offered his arm to her, some gasped in surprise. Crystal looked surprised too, but she softly accepted his arm. They paused for a photo with Greg standing between the two women before joining Tim, Heather, and the others. "Good evening, everyone," Greg said with a big smile while the group stared in shock. He continued, "I'd like you to meet my girlfriend, Candace." Everyone's greeting was much more lively as Candace nodded and smiled happily yet shyly. Greg turned to Crystal, who looked up at him with nervous blue eyes. "You all know my friend, Crystal. I hope we can move forward without any hard feelings," Greg said, looking into the eyes of his teammates and their dates. He turned back to Crystal and noticed her eyes were getting watery. "Hey, no tears. This is prom, so let's only have smiles," he said with a cheerful grin. Crystal nodded and managed to smile. He turned back to Candace, who gently held his face and kissed him. After she pulled back, Greg felt a rush of happiness and smiled at her. "I missed you too," he said softly. This made his friends cheer in approval. Since they were blocking the way, they moved into the main hall to find their tables. The decorations were lovely, and the dance floor looked inviting, making Greg excited for the night ahead. When Candace arrived at Greg's house later that afternoon, he was waiting by the door. He quickly hugged her and kissed her. They held the kiss for a long time, and when they pulled away, they both grinned widely. That's when he noticed her 2 garment bags. One was for her prom dress, and the other was a suit for him. She remembered how handsome he looked when he came into the living room wearing the suit. His mother, Marion, was there and rushed to hug her son, who seemed so grown up. She took some pictures to send to George, who was on a business trip in Belgium. Candace borrowed his room to change into her dress, and then Marion fussed over her and took photos of them together. Candace could see the longing in Greg's eyes, and it made her feel a mix of warmth and excitement. After saying goodnight to Marion, they hopped into the waiting limo, which drove them to her house to meet Crystal. Candace felt a bit anxious about this part of her plan since Greg and Crystal had a history. During their talks, Greg had said that Crystal mattered to Candace, so he was willing to forgive her, but he hoped for a sincere apology. Candace assured him that she would make sure her little sister owned up to her mistakes and apologized properly. This made Greg feel better. Candace's own prom had not gone well, but she loved being at Greg's. They danced and had fun with his friends, filled with laughter and excitement for the evening. As the party came to an end, Candace and Greg told his friends that the celebration would continue at her house for anyone interested. Tim, Heather, Valerie, and Pete decided to join, while the others had other plans. Greg, Candace, and Crystal got back into the limo, with the others following in their cars. They arrived at the mansion, and Candace led everyone inside. Tim looked around at the family portraits on the walls, his eyes wide. "Wow, this is impressive," Crystal laughed. "Yes, our mom plans to donate them to the local museum." Pete noticed something missing. "Where's the painting of your dad?" Crystal shook her head. "Thank goodness there isn't one." Missy appeared at the doorway with a smile. "I heard my name, so I wanted to say goodnight before heading up," she said as she made her way to the grand staircase leading to the second floor. "Good evening, Mrs. Tafferty. We promise to keep it down," Tim said politely. "Please call me Missy. Don't be concerned about the noise. This big house could use some life." She laughed and waved off their worried looks. "Enjoy yourselves." With a forced smile, she headed upstairs. Candace watched her go with a hint of sadness, and Greg held her hand, bringing her back to him. She hugged his arm tightly. Seeing that some friends were interested in the mansion's decorations, Crystal offered to show them around. Greg and Candace followed behind. The lounge, known as the trophy room, was filled with photos capturing the family's joyful moments. Tim immediately spotted a football in a glass display. Crystal noticed his interest and smiled. "That's the winning ball from Cal's big game." Everyone turned to Candace, recalling how Cal had tried to harm her, leaving a complicated history between them. Candace felt a mix of emotions and approached the display. She lifted the glass cover and picked up the football, noticing it was a bit deflated. She glanced over at Tim. "This was the best time in my brother's life when he had the most chance to succeed. He was starting to have problems with drinking, but it wasn't the main part of his life yet. And he wasn't as clever as you," she said with a small smile as she tossed the ball to him. Tim caught the ball and smiled back at Candace. Then he frowned when he noticed how flat it was. "This little guy needs air," he said. Candace smiled again. "There's a ball pump in the garage hanging on the back wall." Pete smiled and hurried off as Candace pointed him to the last door in the hallway. They looked at the pictures on the wall while Crystal read the captions. Many were photos of new mines opening. Crystal smiled as she pointed to an old black and white photo of some men in front of a mine entrance. This one was the first mine the Tafferty family opened, which began their business. It closed years ago, but I remember visiting the museum before it shut down, too. "Who runs the company now that your dad is away?" Valerie asked carefully. Crystal glanced at Candace, who smiled shyly. "The board of directors oversees the company, and the staff manages the daily work, but I own most of the shares now. It should have gone to Missy, but their agreement was tough. We couldn't find a way around it. Daddy lost his share due to his wrongdoings. The agreement made sure no one involved in crime could keep their shares, so they went to his next of kin, which was supposed to be Cal, but came to me instead." "You're also the CEO?" Crystal said proudly, looking at her sister. She's too modest to say the board chose her to take over Daddy's job after she insisted they change the rules to prevent this from happening again. Greg looked at Candace in surprise. She smiled at him shyly and bit her lip. That's incredible, he said with excitement. Is this what you wanted to do? Her smile grew and she nodded. There is a lot of good we can do for the community that the company used to support but stopped after my mother passed. Daddy lost interest in helping after that. Pete came back with the pump and helped Tim inflate the game ball until it looked good again. They continued the tour and ended up on the deck behind the building. Beyond it was the pool, a garden, and a large lawn. That's a lot of lawn to mow, Tim said. Yeah, it's almost big enough for a football field, Pete replied excitedly, then raced off into the shadows. Tim exchanged an amused look with Greg, then shook his head. Suddenly they heard a loud noise, and seconds later, Byron surprised them by stepping out from the shadows of the pool house and walking toward them quickly. He approached them with tension in the air. He did not seem well. His hair and beard had grown wild, and his clothes were very dirty. Even from a distance, he had a bad smell. His eyes showed a wild rage as he confronted Candace. I knew you would show up eventually, he said with a grin, gripping his weapon tightly. You've been hiding out? Greg asked, trying to think of a way to keep Byron from harming Candace. No. I heard she was at Everling's banquet hall, so I came here to settle things, Byron snapped, finishing with a harsh grin. I'm surprised you still have pals in town given how you treated people, Greg said as he moved between Byron and Candace, making the older man growl. Tim pulled back his arm and threw the football at Byron's head. It hit him with a loud doink! Byron stumbled, his head snapping to the side, but he stayed upright and still held his weapon. The football bounced off Byron's head and flew toward Greg, who grabbed it out of the air and held it close. Seeing Byron's gaze shift toward Tim, Greg moved away from Candace and Crystal to draw Byron's attention back to him. Hey! Greg shouted. I catch everything, even a lousy throw, he said, tossing the ball in the air. Byron shook his head, trying to see clearly, and swung his weapon at Greg just as Pete charged in from behind. The weapon fired loudly and the football burst. Pete tackled Byron to the ground, and the older man hit his head hard on the patio. Tim jumped in and stomped on Byron's wrist, making the weapon slip from his grip. He looked at Byron and saw he was unconscious. He kicked the weapon away and turned to Pete. That was a lot tougher than I thought, Pete groaned. Blood covered his shoulder and he had a small cut on his ear. Valerie rushed over to check on him. Heather was on the phone with the police. Tim ran to Greg, who was looking at a rip in his sleeve with alarm. Greg took off his jacket, revealing a small cut on his shirt where the bullet had grazed him. Candace helped Greg take off his shirt, and the injury was only a surface scratch. Greg looked at Tim with a shaky smile. 'Tis but a flesh wound. Sirens sped up to the mansion, and Missy followed the state troopers through the house to the back patio door where they took charge of the situation. The sheriff's team had been investigated and let go, so the town depended on the troopers for now. I heard a loud noise, Missy exclaimed as she looked in shock at Byron on the ground. She gasped in alarm at Greg's injury and hurried over to him. Her eyes grew wide as she noticed his hurt arm. Candace smiled at Missy's embarrassed look and the guilt she felt for staring at her boyfriend. Medics arrived and quickly checked the injured. Byron had a broken wrist and was still unconscious from hitting his head. They wrapped Greg's arm, told Pete to come with them to the hospital, and left with Byron on a stretcher, accompanied by a trooper. Good job. That throw really surprised him, Greg said to Tim with a raised eyebrow, falling into their usual banter from the game field. The tall blonde grinned and nodded. Yes, it was a good throw. Your catch was excellent, too. Greg tipped his head to his friend. Thank you. They looked over at Pete, who, despite the pain in his ear, wore a big, happy grin at being part of their playful chats. Nice tackle, Pete, Tim said calmly. Definitely, Greg added. Pete chuckled but quickly regained his composure. Thank you, gentlemen, he replied, mimicking their polite words. The ladies watched them with puzzled and surprised faces. Tim reached out a hand to Heather and she quickly joined him. I think we'll head home now that things have settled down. It was a lovely evening. Greg nodded with a smile as he took Candace's hand. She moved to his side and he looked at his friends. So nice of you to join us. Valerie picked up the game rules and nodded to Pete, who smiled at his friends. It was a night to remember, he said. Everyone burst into laughter as the tension finally lifted. Smiling, they walked back inside and headed to the front door. After hugs and handshakes, Greg's friends said their goodbyes, though Pete and Val would stop by the hospital first. "Can you tell us what that was about at the end?" Candace asked. Greg smiled and nodded. "Tim and I came up with it while playing football. If things got too rough, we would start speaking like gentlemen after each play to help us calm down and remember to behave. It relieved the stress and helped us think clearly." He pointed toward the backyard. "That was quite intense. It felt like the right time to use it." Candace threw her arms around Greg and gave him a quick kiss. When she pulled away, he smiled at her, feeling a bit dizzy. "You saved my life tonight," Candace said firmly. Greg shook his head gently. "It was a team effort. Tim knocked him down and Pete helped. I just distracted him." Candace held his face between her hands. "You stood in front of Daddy when he was going to hurt us. You took his focus off us." Greg smiled. "When you say it like that, it sounds scary." Suddenly, he found himself surrounded by Candace, Crystal, and Missy, who all seemed a bit emotional. When they stepped back, Greg felt a rush of emotions. "I'll say goodnight now. Greg, thank you for keeping my family safe," Missy said. He gave her a small bow. "It was my pleasure." She smiled back, a little distracted, as she glanced at his bare chest before going upstairs. Crystal stood in front of Greg. "Thank you for accepting my apology. I was selfish and didn't treat you well. I'm sorry my worries made me act so upset. I wish I had been a better girlfriend." "You're forgiven. I'm glad to see you owning up to your actions," he replied with a smile. She nodded with a sad smile. "Good night," she said as she walked away. Now it was just Candace and Greg. She took his hands in hers. "I've been looking forward to this night for so long," she said with a shaky voice. Greg felt nervous too. "Are you sure it's okay for us to be up here? What if they hear us?" Candace smiled eagerly. "Do you think we'll be loud?" He returned her smile. "I hope so." She went up the stairs, pulling Greg along behind her. When they reached her door, she looked back at him nervously before leading him inside. He stepped into the room as she closed the door. A desk lamp provided a soft light across the space, showing that the large room was nicely decorated, but had a touch of mess, like a skirt on the floor. He smiled and said, "It's you. So lovely." Candace stepped into his arms, and they shared a deep kiss that left them both breathless when she finally pulled back. She gently guided him toward the bed, and he accidentally stepped on the skirt. Glancing down, he noticed a stain on the carpet. She looked down too and gasped, then quickly looked back at him. "What is it?" he asked. "The carpet wasn't cleaned after Cal attacked me, so it got stained. He fell there when I defended myself," she said quietly. Greg lifted her chin to meet her gaze. "I'm sorry you had to handle that, but I'm proud of you for standing up to him. He picked his own ending." "I'm so thankful you joined us," he said with warmth. Candace pulled Greg onto the bed. They landed softly in each other's arms and rolled to the middle. Greg ended up on top and smiled down at her bright face. She felt different from her sister, more lively beneath him, which he liked. He glanced down and grinned. "Wow," he joked. She laughed, seeing the joy in his eyes. It was clear he appreciated her. "I think we have too many clothes on," he said, and her eyes sparkled with excitement as she nodded. He moved down her body slightly, giving her a quick kiss on the shoulder. Candace gasped, looking at him with eager eyes as he knelt at her feet. Greg's chest was already bare, so he unbuckled his belt. Candace slid her hands under her dress, unzipping it and pulling it down from her shoulders. She wiggled until it came off completely. She stopped when she noticed Greg was still staring. His eyes were wide as he took in the sight of her in her pretty clothes. Greg had gotten rid of his pants and was now completely uncovered. Candace took a moment to admire his fit body. "You still have a couple of things to take off," Greg said softly, a glint in his eyes. "You look amazing," he added. Her smile made his heart feel warm as she reached back and unclipped her top. She held it in place as she slid the straps down. When she was ready to show him, she let it fall. Greg let out a small gasp, clearly impressed. "So lovely," he whispered. She felt a little shy but couldn't stop smiling. Next, she looked at Greg as she slid her last piece down. When she lay back on the bed, he looked at her with surprise. "Wow," he said, genuinely amazed. Candace giggled, pleased with his reaction. Candace and Greg lay together on the bed, sharing a quiet, joyful moment. She gazed at him with a smile, feeling closer than ever. Greg looked at her with a warm grin, and they both relaxed into each other's presence. "You're amazing," he murmured with a gentle smile, holding her close. She laughed softly, still feeling a slight thrill and deep warmth from their shared closeness. They spoke in gentle tones, exchanging small jokes and tender words, each appreciating the other's company. Candace rested her head on his shoulder, and they simply enjoyed being together, the quiet comfort deepening their bond. After a few moments, Candace looked up and whispered, "I feel really happy with you, Greg." Greg brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. "I feel the same way," he replied, his voice full of sincerity. They lay in comfortable silence, their hearts content, knowing they had found something special. Candace looked at Greg, a playful smile on her face. "I want to try something new." He chuckled, amused by her excitement. "Oh? Like what?" She smiled shyly, running her fingers along his arm. "I just want to know how to make you feel as happy as you make me," she said softly, gazing into his eyes. Greg smiled warmly. "Well, I've never really had anyone close to me like this before, so I'm all yours to teach," he replied. They laughed together, a mix of excitement and nervous energy between them. Candace settled close beside him, and they shared quiet, heartfelt glances. "Just let me know what feels right," she said, still a bit unsure but eager to bring him happiness. Greg nodded, visibly moved by her kindness and affection. Their hands intertwined as they relaxed together, finding comfort in each other's warmth. After a few tender moments, Greg pulled her closer, his voice soft. "You mean so much to me, Candace." She looked up at him with gratitude and understanding. "You do to me too," she replied, and they shared a gentle, lingering kiss, their hearts full of affection and trust. The world around them faded as they rested together, their connection deepening as they simply enjoyed each other's presence. Candace and Greg shared a moment of quiet closeness, their eyes locked, filled with warmth and understanding. Greg leaned in, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, and they both smiled, feeling the deep connection between them. "I brought some stuff, just in case," Greg mentioned softly, his voice full of care. Candace shook her head with a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay. I'm prepared. I trust you." They laughed, the mood light and joyful as they held each other. Greg's hands gently rested on her back, and he took a deep breath, overwhelmed by the happiness he felt in that moment. Candace looked at him with a shy grin, feeling safe and grateful. Slowly they leaned closer, sharing a long, tender kiss. Candace felt her heart race, and Greg smiled, clearly feeling the same way. They held each other, letting their shared warmth and closeness speak volumes without any need for words. As they lay side by side, they found themselves laughing and talking about everything and nothing. Candace found comfort in the simple things, his gentle touch, his kindness, and the trust growing between them. Finally, as they drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, they knew this was the beginning of something special, a bond that brought them peace and happiness. Candace suddenly gasped, and Greg looked at her, his face full of warmth as they both shared a moment of deep connection. He held her close, and she wrapped her arms around him, feeling the strong bond that had grown between them. She was overwhelmed with happiness and a deep sense of closeness, feelings she'd rarely experienced before. This time with Greg was more than she'd ever hoped for. When she opened her eyes, she saw him gazing at her with a gentle smile. "I love you, Candace," he whispered, his voice full of kindness. Her heart raced, and before she could stop herself, she began to tear up, feeling a wave of joy she couldn't fully express. She clung to him, resting her head on his shoulder as the emotions took over. "Hey, are those happy tears?" he asked softly, gently stroking her hair. She managed a nod and finally found her voice. "Yes, happy tears," she whispered, smiling through them. Greg smiled, looking into her eyes. "I'm so glad you're happy," he replied tenderly. Candace took a deep breath, her voice small. "I felt alone for so long," she admitted. It felt strange to open up, but with Greg, it felt safe. Greg held her hand, understanding her pain. "I knew you've had to hide a lot of who you are. he said, his voice full of compassion. "But you're not alone anymore." Candace felt her heart warm at his words. "Thank you, Greg. I love you too." They lay together in silence, simply enjoying each other's presence and the comfort of knowing they were finally understood. "You're still big, even when you're not hard." He thought about Heather's accidental words that revealed they had been talking about their closeness. He no longer felt anger or disappointment about it. He understood that some people just share too much with their friends. Maybe he was the strange one for wanting to keep things private. "That doesn't bother you?" he asked again. She shook her head, her eyes shining with excitement. "So, you like big guys?" Greg asked directly, and he watched her eyes widen as she smiled and nodded. Suddenly, there was a loud noise at the bedroom door. They exchanged a glance before Candace jumped out of bed and hurried to open it. "Christ, oh!" Candace gasped when she saw Missy on the floor, trying to pull her clothing back up, her face full of embarrassment. An object lay on the floor beside her. Greg joined Candace at the door, trying to cover himself. "Missy, why were you outside my door?" Candace asked softly. "I'm sorry, Candace. I'm so ashamed," Missy said, covering her face with her hands and starting to cry. Candace looked at Greg, who signaled that he could leave, but she shook her head. He was confused as she knelt beside Missy. "You've been lonely too, haven't you?" she said gently. Missy looked up at Candace, her sad eyes showing her feelings. She nodded. "Daddy was mean to you too," Candace continued. This seemed to break Missy's control again, and tears streamed down her face. "I'm so sorry, Candace. I wanted to be a better mother to you, but Byron was always so angry. The last time, he hurt me badly." A shiver went through her. She looked into Candace's eyes, pleading. "Can you forgive me? I've been weak and you've been so brave." "You have nothing to forgive. I understand what you went through with him. I never wanted you or Crystal to suffer because of me. He's the one to blame," Candace said softly as she took Missy's hands. "Daddy's gone now, so you can start anew. Meet new people." Missy's lip trembled, and her tear-filled eyes looked at Candace. "No one here likes me because of him. Byron married me to show me off, and I hate to admit that's all I've been. My mom had me in beauty contests since I was little, and I've relied on my looks my whole life. I don't have any other skills, and I'm scared I raised Crystal to think the same way." She took a few sharp breaths, trying not to cry. "I don't know how to begin again, and I can't afford to because I have no savings. Byron made sure I depended on him." Candace sighed and kissed her forehead. "Please remember, you are always welcome here. You're my family, and I love you." Missy held tightly to Candace's hands and pressed her forehead against them as tears rolled down her cheeks. Candace exchanged a worried look with Greg. He nodded and tilted his head toward the item on the floor near Missy, raising an eyebrow as if to ask what she was doing outside the door. She smiled and nodded, pausing for a moment as she looked at Missy. Then she made eye contact with Greg, who was still holding his clothes. He glanced down, then quickly met her eyes again, looking concerned. "Missy, why don't I help you back to your room? We can talk more in the morning," Candace said gently. Missy nodded, struggling to stand while giving Greg an embarrassed glance. She looked at him for a brief moment, as if trying to remember that moment, and then bent down to pick up her belongings. Then she noticed her toy. Missy squeaked in embarrassment as she picked it up and stood quickly. Candace wrapped her arms around Missy and led her down the hallway as Greg stayed behind. When Candace returned, she closed the door softly and embraced Greg. After she stepped back, Greg looked at her thoughtfully. "What are you thinking about?" She smiled, kissed him, and guided him back to bed, gently taking his clothes from his hands and letting them fall to the floor. They settled onto the bed, lying on their sides and facing one another. "You love me?" Candace asked. "I do," Greg replied without hesitation. She smiled back. "I love you too," she said, kissing him gently. "During our calls while I was away, we didn't finish our conversation about your plans after graduation," she said. "I will manage the family business, but what are your plans? You mentioned going to college nearby?" Greg nodded, admiring Candace's blue eyes. "Yes, I got accepted into the computer sciences program. I'm studying data security." "Are you going to work with your dad?" she asked. "No, there's too much travel in his job. I wouldn't want to be away from home like that. It's tough on Mom, Greg admitted. Candace smiled and nodded. You want to stay home while you go to college to be with your mother? He regarded her carefully. That was my plan. Is something wrong? No. I care about your mother and want her to be happy. I didn't realize how hard it must be for her with her husband traveling, Candace confessed. Greg noticed her thoughtful expression but wasn't sure what she was working through. Her eyes met his again and she gave a shy smile. There's a lot of loneliness and only one Greg. His eyebrows lifted in surprise. While you were in college, I thought about asking you to move in with me, but I see now that wouldn't be fair to your mother, she said with a sad smile. She put her finger on his lips to signal him to wait as she continued speaking. I'd like you to think about something else. When your father comes back from his trips, why not spend your nights here? Greg thought it over for a moment and nodded. That makes sense. I wasn't planning to stay at home forever after I graduate. I need to move out eventually. Dad will have to change his schedule to be home more because he can't keep doing this. Candace smiled brightly and gave him another kiss. They leaned back together, and Greg noticed Candace's hand gently resting on his leg. It feels nice like this too, she said with a laugh. It's not going to stay that way for long, he replied with a teasing look. She looked down for a moment. There's something else to think about. Her eyes met his and he could see she was a bit anxious. I'm not the only one here who feels lonely. Greg heard her but struggled to understand what she meant. He blinked, feeling confused. But I broke up with Crystal, he said firmly. Candace shook her head. Crystal will be busy with college and will find her place. She's young, strong, and will be okay. I'm talking about Missy. She doesn't have anyone else and no plans for her future. Greg sat up a little, looking at Candace with concern. But I'm your boyfriend. Don't you want that? I do, more than anything. I'm so grateful you let me into your life, and I'm so happy to share my feelings with you, she quickly said. But you want me to be with Missy? He asked, still unsure. Candace placed her hand on his chest. I want to keep loving you and getting to know you better. Everything I've seen in you shows me that you're a wonderful person who has so much love to give. Your parents' love shines through you. I want to have your love in my life, exploring that in many ways with you through closeness and just enjoying our time together. Greg felt a wave of relief. He wanted those things too. Candace took a deep breath and held his gaze. None of that would change if I cared for someone else too. I'm not asking you to be Missy's boyfriend. You are mine. But Missy really needs some closeness in her life. Crystal mentioned that Missy has some things that provide her with some comfort, but they aren't the same as true connection. Greg looked deeply into Candace's eyes and saw her sincerity. He understood she was serious about this, but he had been in a complicated situation before, and the past made him uneasy. I'm not sure about this. I promise, I'm not using you like Crystal did. I wouldn't risk what we have now that I've found something real. If you don't feel comfortable with this, I understand and will respect your decision. But I also believe that your heart can hold so much love. I'm thankful you've let me in. I promise I will always be honest with you, Candace said gently. He looked at her and could see she truly meant what she said. He also felt her affection. A strange feeling grew inside him, and he understood he needed her. He leaned closer and shared a deep kiss, feeling connected to her. They shared a special moment again, this time with more intensity, as if they were claiming each other. Greg was full of energy and determination, while Candace held on and embraced the passion between them. She expressed her happiness first, and Greg's feelings followed closely behind as he gazed into her eyes. He recognized her acceptance and longing as they shared warmth. They kissed again, this time soft and gentle. Greg moved beside her as she nestled closer against him. This was what Greg had always wanted, someone who cared for him as much as his mother cared for his father. Candace understood him well. He had always looked up to his parents' love. His new relationship was different, but that didn't mean it was any less valuable. He still wondered if involving someone else in their bond was a good choice, but he felt more assured of Candace's love for him. That confidence made everything feel possible. We'll talk to Missy in the morning, he said softly to Candace. She lifted her head and looked at him. He could see the love in her eyes. She kissed him gently and snuggled closer. Candace felt warmth spread through her as she realized how deeply Greg cared for her. He wasn't the type to just say, "I love you." For him, love was something real and essential. He had opened his heart to her, showing he was willing to risk pain for her. That was the greatest sign of trust. His love and trust helped ease the loneliness she had felt for so long. There was nothing better than this. Greg loved to run. For the past month, he had been running home from his summer job at a home improvement store. He took the job to earn money for college expenses. Although his girlfriend had money, he wanted to be independent. His girlfriend was currently riding her pink bicycle beside him, cheerful streamers flying from her handlebars. On nights like this, she would meet him at the store and join him on the way home. This week, Greg's dad was back in town, so Greg would spend his evenings with Candace. They entered her neighborhood, following the winding road until they passed the Gordons' house. They had installed a new glass enclosure around their pool and added stone blocks to protect it. Candace waved to Belinda Gordon, who smiled and waved back. Before long, Greg and Candace reached the long path leading to her home. The mansion felt grand and overly spacious for the few family members living there, yet it remained the cherished home of the Tafferty family. As they reached the front door, Missy opened it with a warm smile. Her eyes sparkled with joy as she welcomed them back. Greg noticed Candace's hair, now free from her helmet, catching the light. She was letting her natural color grow back, though the pink at the ends would likely stay for a while due to the length. After storing the bike, Candace climbed the steps, and Missy greeted her with a friendly kiss on the cheek. Greg followed them inside, glancing around at the now more inviting entrance. The once stern portraits of Tafferty ancestors were gone, as Missy had thoughtfully sent them to the local museum, making the space feel less daunting. "Crystal headed off for her European tour this morning," Missy informed them with a cheerful expression. Greg looked thoughtful. "She'll stay with the tour group, right?" he asked, sounding concerned. Missy smiled at his protectiveness. "Yes, she promised to stick with the group and check in every night." Greg nodded, and Candace smiled at him warmly. "What? I can't help but worry," he admitted with a shrug. Candace stepped close, hugging him, and gave him a light, affectionate kiss. Pulling back, she raised her eyebrows playfully. "I think we should get you upstairs, out of those sweaty running clothes, and into a shower." Greg noticed Missy's amused glance and nodded, following Candace up the stairs. Missy walked with them, and they headed into the spacious master bedroom where Greg often stayed. The ensuite had a large shower, perfect for unwinding after their outing. Once inside, they each took turns freshening up, enjoying the warmth of the water and the comfort of being together in a place that now felt like home. Greg felt a wave of contentment as he let the day's stress rinse away, grateful for the companionship and closeness they shared. Greg noticed how happy Candace seemed, so he didn't question it. She turned to him, meeting his gaze warmly, and leaned in to share a close, affectionate kiss. Their hands rested on each other's shoulders, and they both felt a quiet contentment, each enjoying the simple closeness. Candace stepped back and looked at him with a playful grin, a spark of excitement in her eyes. She then turned to Missy, encouraging her with a reassuring smile. Greg helped Missy to her feet, supporting her gently as she steadied herself. They exchanged friendly smiles, and Candace gave Missy a quick hug, wrapping her in a soft towel. They all shared a laugh as they dried off, the light-hearted moment easing the energy in the room. Once they were all dried and dressed, they made their way back to the main area of the house. Greg caught a warm glance from both Candace and Missy, sensing how much these small gestures of care meant to each of them. They settled together in the cozy living room, grateful for the quiet bond they shared. The simple moments, the supportive smiles, and the gentle companionship filled the space with warmth, creating a calm and friendly atmosphere they all appreciated. She carefully sat on the toilet to catch her breath. Greg quickly knelt in front of Candace and showered her with gentle attention until she let out a joyful cry, her fingers tangled in his hair. When he stood up, he helped her sit at the edge of the counter, gently spreading her legs. Candace felt a mix of sensations as he moved closer. She leaned back, feeling the warmth between them. When they were close, he leaned in for a kiss, filled with excitement and emotion, making her gasp softly as her own feelings grew. He began to move with her slowly at first, then picked up the pace, creating a rhythm that made her feel wonderful. Finally, overwhelmed by the moment, Greg pressed against her, a wave of feeling washing over them both. "Yes, Greg, this feels amazing," she cheered, then went silent for a moment as another wave of joy washed over her. They took some time to breathe and relax. Missy handed Candace a towel and draped one over Greg's shoulders as he stepped back. Then, Missy knelt in front of Greg for a moment, making him jump a little, but she smiled and pulled back. Missy stood, beaming as she gently walked toward the door. "Don't take too long. Dinner is almost ready." Candace smiled at Greg as he watched Missy leave. He turned back to her and kissed her softly. She looked into his eyes and sighed happily. "I love you, Mr. Hughes." Greg's heart filled with joy as he replied, "I love you, Miss Tafferty." They dried off while stealing glances at each other, both knowing they would share more special moments after dinner, but also aware that they shouldn't keep Missy waiting. Everything was going well for them. Greg kept his mother company while his father was away. Sometimes Candace spent the night at his place just to rest. She loved his mother, and they got along wonderfully. He was really glad that Candace had made so many friends. Many people in the community had welcomed her, though a few still held on to their hurt feelings. Thankfully, they weren't harmful. After her father was sent to prison for life, she held a press conference. She apologized to the town for pretending to be someone she wasn't while looking into her father's plans. Most people understood her situation. She shared how acting in that way helped her see how defensive and unfriendly she had been before. It felt much better to listen to and accept others. This change made her feel like a better person. She thanked everyone for being kind. Greg thought some didn't deserve such thanks, but he chose to let it go. Margaret Stewart, the head nurse at the hospital, became Candace's biggest supporter. She was strong, but her heart was so kind. As CEO, Candace started to bring back the community projects that the company used to support, and the county was benefiting again from their main industry. She loved her work. While sitting across from Candace, Greg looked into her eyes and saw her love for him reflected back. That filled him with such joy he could hardly contain it. He turned to Missy, who was at the head of the table. He noticed she was also looking at him with warmth. He wasn't sure how to respond, but he gave her a friendly smile as he felt his cheeks get warm. She giggled softly. When he looked back at Candace, he saw her smiling happily. She was enjoying his embarrassment. After dinner, he planned a playful response for both ladies that would leave them laughing. He shifted uncomfortably as his clothes felt a little tight. The ladies giggled again. Yes, he would have his fun, but could he really call it fun if they were excited about it? Hey everyone! Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the exciting stories we have coming up. What do you think about the characters in this story? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.